September 9th, 2025. Polar bear kills soldier. During Arctic training mission, the wind howled across the barren landscape of Resolute Bay like the breath of some ancient, malevolent spirit, carrying with it the scent of ice, death, and something far more primal that made the hair on the back of Private Samuel Porter's neck stand on end. At 24 years old, Samuel had seen his share of harsh environments during his 6 years with the Canadian Armed Forces, but nothing had prepared him for the stark, alien beauty and bone-deep cold of the Arctic archipelago. The temperature had dropped to -38 degrees Celsius, and even through his specialized cold weather gear, he could feel the environment trying to claim him, trying to freeze the very life from his bones. Samuel David Porter had grown up in the temperate forests of New Brunswick, where the most dangerous wildlife he'd encountered were black bears that could usually be scared off with loud noises and aggressive posturing. His father, Michael Porter, had been a park ranger for 30 years and had instilled in Samuel a deep respect for nature and wildlife. His mother, Catherine, was a nurse who had taught him basic first aid and emergency medical procedures. These skills had served him well during his military training, but now, standing on the edge of the known world, Samuel felt the inadequacy of his woodland experience like a cold weight in his stomach. The exercise, designated Operation Arctic Shield, had been planned for months. 12 soldiers from the 3rd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, had been deployed to conduct cold weather survival training and to test new Arctic warfare equipment. The mission was supposed to last 2 weeks, during which they would establish temporary camps, practice long-range reconnaissance, and simulate defensive positions against hypothetical enemy forces. What nobody had factored into their careful planning was the presence of a massive male polar bear, estimated later to weigh over 800 pounds, that had been tracking their movements for the past 3 days. Sergeant Major Elena Rodriguez, the expedition leader, was a 38-year-old career soldier from Edmonton who had cut her teeth in Afghanistan and had personally requested this assignment. Her dark eyes constantly scanned the horizon as she moved through the camp, checking equipment and monitoring her soldiers. Eleanor had an intuitive understanding of danger that had kept her alive through 3 combat deployments, and for the past 48 hours, that intuition had been screaming at her that something was wrong. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, hunted, but every time she brought up her concerns, the rational part of her mind dismissed them as paranoia brought on by the alien environment. Corporal James Mitchell, 28, from Calgary, was the unit's designated marksman and survival specialist. Standing 6 feet 2 inches with shoulders broad enough to carry a small tree, James had spent his childhood hunting elk and moose in the Canadian Rockies with his grandfather, a Métis trapper who had taught him to read the land like a book. James carried a C-14 Timberwolf sniper rifle and had qualified expert with every weapon in the Canadian military arsenal, but as he scanned the endless white expanse through his scope, he felt a growing unease that had nothing to do with enemy soldiers and everything to do with the primitive part of his brain that recognized when a predator was near. The base camp had been established 3 miles inland from the coast in a relatively sheltered depression between 2 low ridges. The soldiers had set up 4 Arctic-rated tents in a defensive perimeter with a central area for equipment and supplies. Master Corporal David Kim, the unit's communications specialist, had rigged a satellite uplink that provided intermittent contact with their command base in Yellowknife. David, 26, from Vancouver, was of Korean descent and had joined the military to pay for his engineering degree. His technical expertise had made him invaluable during the mission, but the constant equipment failures caused by the extreme cold were beginning to wear on his nerves. Private Alexandra Alex Thompson, 22, from St. John's, Newfoundland, was the unit's medic and the youngest member of the team. Her red hair was constantly escaping from under her watch cap, and her freckled face bore a perpetual expression of determined concentration. Alex had joined the military straight out of high school, driven by a desire to serve her country and gain medical experience before pursuing a career as a paramedic. She carried an extensive medical kit and had cross-trained with civilian emergency medical technicians, but her knowledge of trauma medicine was about to be tested in ways she had never imagined. The bear first appeared on their motion sensors on September 6th, 3 days into the exercise. Initially dismissed as a false alarm caused by blowing snow or equipment malfunction, the intermittent contacts gradually formed a pattern that suggested something large was circling their position at a distance of approximately 2 kilometers. Corporal Lisa Chen, 27, from Toronto, was the unit's intelligence analyst and had been tasked with monitoring the sensor network. Her background in criminal justice had taught her to look for patterns in seemingly random data, and what she was seeing in the sensor logs made her increasingly uncomfortable. Sergeant Major, Lisa had reported on the evening of September 7th, her breath forming crystalline clouds in the frigid air of the command tent. I'm seeing consistent contacts on the perimeter sensors, always moving, always at distance, but following a pattern that suggests intentional reconnaissance rather than random animal movement. Elena had studied the data, her weathered face illuminated by the green glow of the tactical display. Could be a wolf pack. They're known to scout potential prey for days before making a move. But Private Robert Bobby Williams, 23, from Halifax, Nova Scotia, had grown up hunting with his father and grandfather in the maritime provinces, and he knew wolf behavior. Bobby was built like a linebacker, with massive hands and a deceptively gentle demeanor that masked his competence with automatic weapons. Wolves don't move like that, Sergeant Major. This is something bigger, something that doesn't need a pack to take down prey. The morning of September 8th had dawned clear and bitterly cold, with visibility extending for miles across the Arctic tundra. Private Marcus Johnson, 25, from Winnipeg, Manitoba, was on perimeter watch when he first saw the tracks. Marcus was of Cree descent and had learned traditional hunting skills from his uncle, a respected elder who had taught him to read sign in the wilderness. The tracks he found were unlike anything in his experience, massive paw prints, each the size of a dinner plate, with claw marks extending well beyond the pad impressions. "Sergeant Major," Marcus had called over the radio, his voice tight with controlled alarm, "you need to see this." Elena had made her way to Marcus's position on the northwestern edge of their perimeter, accompanied by James Mitchell and his rifle. The tracks formed a clear trail that circled their camp at a distance of roughly 150 meters, close enough for detailed observation, but far enough to avoid direct confrontation. The depth of the impressions and the length of the stride indicated an animal of enormous size and weight. James knelt beside the largest track, using his combat knife to probe the frozen impression. "This is a polar bear, and it's a big one. Male, probably 800 pounds or more, and it's been watching us for at least 2 days." Elena felt her throat constrict as the implications sank in. Polar bears were the apex predators of the Arctic, capable of taking down seals, walruses, and even beluga whales. Unlike their brown bear cousins, polar bears were true carnivores with no fear of humans and a hunting instinct honed by millions of years of evolution in one of the world's harshest environments. Adult males could run at speeds of up to 30 miles per hour, despite their massive size, could swim for hours in frigid water, and possessed bite strength capable of crushing a human skull like an eggshell. "We need to contact base camp immediately," Elena decided, keying her radio. "This is Arctic Shield Base, requesting immediate priority contact with command." But David Kim's attempts to establish satellite communication were met with static and interference. The severe weather conditions that had been building throughout the day were disrupting their uplink, leaving them effectively isolated until the storm passed. Private Jennifer Jen Watson, 24, from Ottawa, Ontario, was the unit's meteorologist and had been tracking the approaching weather system. Her latest forecast called for heavy snow, high winds, and near-zero visibility for the next 18 to 24 hours. "We're going to be socked in until tomorrow afternoon at the earliest," Jen reported, her voice barely audible over the increasing wind. "Temperature's going to drop another 10 degrees, and we're looking at sustained winds of 40 to 50 kilometers per hour with gusts up to 80. Corporal Tom Anderson, 29, from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, was the unit's demolitions expert and had been tasked with preparing defensive positions around the camp. Tom had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and had an intimate understanding of how quickly a secure position could become a death trap. As he placed motion sensors and prepared flares around the perimeter, he couldn't shake the feeling that their carefully planned defensive positions were inadequate against the type of threat they were facing. The storm struck with the fury of an Arctic hurricane just after sunset on September 8th. Wind-driven snow reduced visibility to mere feet, and the temperature plummeted to minus 45 degrees Celsius. The soldiers huddled in their tents, listening to the howling wind and the occasional crack of ice expanding and contracting in the cold. Despite the advanced heating systems in their shelters, frost formed on the inside walls, and every breath became a visible cloud that dissipated slowly in the frigid air. Private Samuel Porter shared a tent with Bobby Williams and Marcus Johnson. As the youngest members of the unit, they had formed a natural camaraderie during their training, bonding over their shared inexperience with Arctic conditions and their determination to prove themselves worthy of their positions. Samuel had been writing letters to his girlfriend, Sarah Mitchell, a teacher back in Fredericton, when the first motion alarm sounded at 2:17 a.m. on September 9th. The alarm was barely audible over the wind, but it was enough to bring all 3 soldiers to full alertness. Samuel grabbed his C7A2 rifle and checked his ammunition while Bobby and Marcus quickly donned their cold weather gear. The standard protocol for a perimeter alarm was to establish radio contact with the command tent and await instructions. But when Bobby tried to raise Sergeant Major Rodriguez, he was met with static. "Radio's dead," Bobby whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. Could be the weather, could be equipment failure. Marcus was studying the tactical display on his handheld GPS unit, which showed the location of the triggered sensor. "Southwest perimeter, about 100 meters out. Could be debris from the storm, but we can't assume that." Through the walls of their tent, they could hear movement in the camp as other soldiers responded to the alarm. The protocol called for 2-person teams to investigate perimeter alerts while maintaining communication with the command post. But the communication failure had thrown their careful procedures into chaos. Samuel could hear muffled voices from the other tents as soldiers struggled to coordinate their response in the howling wind. The second alarm triggered at 2:23 a.m., this time from the eastern perimeter. Then a third alarm from the north, followed rapidly by a fourth from the western edge of their camp. The pattern suggested something large moving around their position in a deliberate circle, probing their defenses and studying their responses. "It's testing us," Marcus said, his voice tight with realization. "Whatever's out there, it's intelligent enough to trigger our senses systematically and observe how we react." Samuel felt his heart rate increase as the implications became clear. This wasn't random animal behavior or storm-related false alarms. Something was hunting them, using tactics that demonstrated an understanding of human defensive measures and a patience that spoke to a highly evolved predator. Sergeant Major Rodriguez had emerged from the command tent and was moving between the other shelters, coordinating the response and attempting to establish visual contact with the perimeter. Her years of combat experience had taught her to trust her instincts, and every instinct she possessed was screaming that they were in immediate danger. The motion sensors were detecting something that was definitely not wind or debris, something that was moving with purpose and intelligence around their position. At 2:31 a.m., the fifth alarm triggered from directly south of the camp, closer than any of the previous contacts. This time, there was no mistaking the deliberate nature of the intrusion. Something large had approached to within 50 meters of their defensive perimeter and was holding position as if waiting for the right moment to strike. James Mitchell had positioned himself with his sniper rifle in a small depression that provided some protection from the wind, while maintaining a clear field of fire toward the most recent sensor contact. Even with his advanced optics and infrared scope, visibility was nearly zero in the driving snow. But years of hunting experience had taught him to rely on more than just vision, and as he lay motionless in his position, he began to detect signs that confirmed his worst fears. The wind carried a scent that was unlike anything in his experience, a musky, predatory odor that triggered every primitive alarm in his nervous system. It was the smell of a large carnivore, something that had recently fed and was now evaluating new prey. Mixed with the scent was another odor that made his blood run cold. The smell of human blood, fresh and still warm despite the frigid temperature. At 2:38 a.m., the motion sensors fell silent, not because the threat had moved away, but because something had methodically destroyed each sensor in sequence, moving from one to the next with the precision of a military operation. The sudden absence of electronic surveillance left the soldiers blind and vulnerable, trapped in their defensive positions by a storm that provided perfect cover for whatever was stalking them. Samuel was checking his rifle for the third time when he heard Bobby's sharp intake of breath. "Movement," Bobby whispered, pointing toward the southwestern edge of their camp. "Something big, maybe 40 meters out." Through the driving snow, Samuel caught a glimpse of a massive white shape moving with surprising stealth for something of its size. The shape disappeared and reappeared as the wind shifted the snow. But there was no mistaking the deliberate nature of its movement. Whatever was out there was positioning itself for an attack, using the storm as cover while it closed the distance to their camp. The attack began at 2:43 a.m. with a sound that would haunt Samuel Porter for the rest of his life. A deep rumbling roar that cut through the howling wind like a chainsaw through silk. The sound was unlike anything he had ever heard, combining the raw power of a freight train with the primal fury of a predator that had decided the time for stalking was over. The massive polar bear burst through the southwestern perimeter like a white avalanche, moving faster than anything that large had any right to move. In the split second before chaos erupted, Samuel caught a clear view of the animal that had been hunting them. It was enormous, standing nearly 4 feet at the shoulder, even on all fours, with a head the size of a bathtub and paws that could cover a dinner plate. Its black eyes reflected the emergency lighting from their camp, and its partially open mouth revealed canine teeth longer than Samuel's fingers. The bear's first target was Private Jennifer Watson, who had been manning an observation post on the southern perimeter. Jen had less than 3 seconds to react as 800 pounds of Arctic predator charged directly toward her position. Her training kicked in, and she managed to fire 2 rounds from her C7A2 rifle before the bear reached her. Both shots struck the animal's massive chest, but the bear's thick hide and layers of fat absorbed the impact with no apparent effect. What happened next unfolded with the horrific precision of a nightmare. The bear struck Jen with one massive paw, sending her flying backward into the side of the nearest tent with enough force to collapse the shelter's support structure. The sound of her impact was audible even over the storm, a wet, crushing noise that spoke of broken bones and internal injuries. Jen's scream was cut short as the bear followed up its initial attack, its massive jaws closing around her torso with a bite force of over 1,200 pounds per square inch. Samuel was running toward Jen's position before his conscious mind had fully processed what was happening. His rifle was up and firing, the muzzle flashes strobing through the storm as he put round after round into the bear's massive frame. Bobby and Marcus were right behind him, their own weapons adding to the volume of fire, but the bear seemed to absorb the punishment without slowing down. Sergeant Major Rodriguez was shouting orders over the radio, but the storm and the chaos of the attack made coordination nearly impossible. "All units converge on the southern perimeter. We have a polar bear in the camp. Use maximum force authorized." James Mitchell was trying to line up a clear shot with his sniper rifle, but the bear's position made it impossible to fire without risking hitting his own people. The animal had dragged Jen's motionless form behind a collapsed tent, using the shelter as cover while it continued its attack. The tactical situation was becoming a nightmare. They had superior firepower and numbers, but the bear's intelligence and use of terrain was neutralizing their advantages. Corporal Thomas Anderson was moving toward the bear's position with a grenade launcher, but the proximity of his fellow soldiers made the use of explosives impossible. The bear seemed to understand this, keeping close to the tents and using the soldiers' own equipment as shields against their weapons. At 2:47 a.m., the bear released Jen's body and turned its attention to its next target. Private Samuel Porter had approached to within 20 meters of the animal's position, his rifle empty and his hand shaking as he fumbled for a fresh magazine. The bear's black eyes locked onto his, and Samuel felt a moment of paralyzing terror as he realized he was now the focus of 800 pounds of Arctic predator. The bear charged again, covering the distance between them in less than 2 seconds. Samuel managed to slam a fresh magazine into his rifle and fire 3 rounds before the animal reached him. 2 shots went wide in his panic, but the third struck the bear in the shoulder, spinning the massive animal slightly to the left. It wasn't enough to stop the attack. The bear's massive paw caught Samuel in the chest, lifting him off his feet and sending him tumbling backward into the snow. The impact drove the air from his lungs and sent his rifle spinning away into the darkness. As he struggled to breathe, Samuel found himself looking up at 800 pounds of polar bear standing over him, its hot breath forming clouds in the frigid air as it prepared to deliver the killing blow. Time seemed to slow as Samuel stared up at his death. The bear's massive head descended toward him, its jaws opening to reveal teeth designed by evolution to crush seal skulls and tear through thick blubber. Samuel could smell the animal's predatory musk, could see the intelligence in its black eyes as it calculated the best way to kill him. The salvation came from an unexpected direction. Master Corporal David Kim had abandoned his communication equipment and was charging toward the bear with nothing but a combat knife and a flare gun. The flare struck the bear in the side of the head, exploding in a shower of red sparks and chemical fire that temporarily blinded the animal and caused it to rear back in pain and confusion. The distraction gave Bobby Williams the opening he needed. From a position 30 meters away, Bobby put a full magazine of ammunition into the bear's exposed flank, the heavy 5.56mm rounds finally beginning to have an effect as they penetrated the animal's vital organs. The bear roared in pain and fury, turning away from Samuel to face this new threat. But the animal's tactical intelligence hadn't abandoned it even in its wounded state. Instead of charging directly toward Bobby's muzzle flashes, the bear used the collapsed tents and scattered equipment as cover, moving in a zigzag pattern that made it difficult to target effectively. It was clear that this animal had encountered humans before and had learned from the experience. Private Marcus Johnson was trying to flank the bear from the eastern side of the camp when disaster struck again. The animal, moving faster than anything that large should be able to move, suddenly changed direction and charged directly toward Marcus's position. Marcus had time for one burst from his rifle before 800 pounds of Arctic predator slammed into him like a freight train. The impact sent Marcus flying backward over a supply crate, his rifle torn from his hands by the force of the collision. The bear followed up immediately, its massive jaws closing around Marcus's left leg with a crushing bite that shattered his femur and tibia simultaneously. Marcus's scream of agony cut through the storm like a siren, galvanizing the other soldiers into desperate action. Alexandra Thompson was moving toward Marcus's position with her medical kit when she realized the tactical situation had become completely untenable. The bear was using the wounded soldier as bait, positioning itself so that any rescue attempt would bring the rescuer within range of its massive claws and teeth. It was a level of tactical thinking that should have been impossible for an animal, but the evidence was right in front of her. Sergeant Major Rodriguez made the decision that would haunt her for the rest of her career. All units fall back to secondary positions. We cannot engage effectively in these conditions. The order to retreat went against every instinct Elena possessed, but she could see that continuing the fight in the current tactical situation would only result in more casualties. The storm was providing too much cover for the bear, and their own defensive positions were working against them by limiting their fields of fire. As the soldiers began to fall back toward the eastern edge of the camp, the bear made its final devastating move. Instead of pursuing the retreating humans, it turned its attention back to Private Samuel Porter, who was still struggling to recover from the impact that had knocked him down. Samuel had managed to retrieve his rifle and was trying to crawl toward the relative safety of an overturned supply container when the bear's massive shadow fell across him. This time, there was no last-second rescue. The bear's massive paw came down on Samuel's back with enough force to drive him face first into the frozen ground. The animal's claws, each over 3 inches long, penetrated through Samuel's cold-weather gear and into his flesh like knives through paper. Samuel's scream was muffled by the snow, but his agony was audible to every soldier in the camp. The bear's jaws closed around Samuel's neck and shoulders, its massive canine teeth penetrating deep into his throat and crushing his cervical vertebrae with an audible crack that carried even over the storm. Samuel Porter, 24 years old, from New Brunswick, Canada, died at 2:51 a.m. on September 9th, 2025, in the jaws of the largest polar bear any of the survivors would ever see. The bear held Samuel's body for nearly 30 seconds, shaking it like a dog with a toy to ensure its prey was completely dead. When it finally released him, Samuel's neck was twisted at an impossible angle, and his cold-weather gear was soaked with blood that steamed in the frigid air. Having achieved its objective, the bear gathered up Marcus Johnson's still living but critically wounded form and began to retreat toward the northwestern edge of the camp. Marcus was unconscious from shock and blood loss, his shattered leg leaving a trail of crimson drops in the snow as the bear dragged him away into the storm. The soldiers could only watch in horror as their friend and comrade disappeared into the white darkness, carried off by a predator that had demonstrated tactical intelligence beyond anything they had been trained to expect. The attack had lasted less than 8 minutes, but it had shattered their unit's cohesion and left them with 1 dead, 1 missing and presumed dead, and 1 critically wounded soldier. As the bear's massive form vanished into the storm, carrying Marcus with it, the surviving soldiers were left to deal with the immediate aftermath of the attack. Private Jennifer Watson was barely alive, her chest crushed and her breathing shallow and labored. Alexandra Thompson was working frantically to stabilize her injuries, but without immediate medical evacuation, Jen's chances of survival were minimal. "I need to establish communication with base camp immediately," Eleanor ordered, her voice shaking with controlled fury and desperation. "We need medical evacuation for Watson, and we need it now." But David Kim's attempts to restore satellite communication were still being frustrated by the storm. The winds had increased to over 60 kilometers per hour, and the heavy snow was disrupting their uplink to the point where even emergency frequencies were unusable. "I can't get through," David reported, his voice tight with frustration. "The storm is blocking everything. We're going to have to wait until it passes before we can call for help." The realization that they were completely isolated, with wounded soldiers and a massive predator still in the area, settled over the survivors like a death shroud. They had weapons, they had training, and they had superior numbers, but none of that had been enough to prevent the bear from killing one of their own and carrying off another. As Alexandra continued her desperate efforts to keep Jennifer Watson alive, the other soldiers began the grim task of securing Samuel Porter's body and establishing a new defensive perimeter. The bear had demonstrated that it was still in the area and might return to finish what it had started. The storm continued to rage around them, and somewhere in the white darkness, 800 pounds of apex predator was feeding on their friend and planning its next move. The night was far from over, and none of them knew if they would live to see the dawn. The hours that followed the attack passed with agonizing slowness. Alexandra Thompson worked tirelessly over Jennifer Watson's broken body, using every technique she had learned in her medical training to keep the critically injured soldier alive. Jen's breathing was shallow and irregular, her pulse weak and thready, and Alex could feel the life ebbing from her friend with each passing minute. "I need to establish an airway," Alex muttered, her hands shaking as she prepared an emergency tracheostomy kit. "Her larynx is crushed and she's not getting enough oxygen." The procedure had to be performed by flashlight in the ruins of their camp, with Bobby Williams holding a poncho over them to provide some protection from the driving snow. Alex's hands were steady, despite the cold and the horrific circumstances, her training taking over as she made a precise incision in Jen's throat and inserted the breathing tube. The immediate improvement in Jen's breathing was minimal, but it was enough to buy them precious time. Sergeant Major Rodriguez had reorganized the surviving soldiers into a tight defensive perimeter around their remaining intact shelter. The bear's attack had destroyed most of their equipment and scattered their supplies across the campsite, leaving them with minimal resources to survive the remainder of the storm. Elena's combat experience told her that the bear would likely return, possibly before dawn, and they needed to be ready. "James, I want you positioned on the northeastern ridge with overwatch," Elena ordered, her voice carrying clearly despite the wind. "If that thing comes back, I want advance warning and a clear shot." James Mitchell nodded grimly as he gathered his sniper rifle and cold weather gear. The ridge was approximately 200 meters from their current position, close enough to provide effective cover fire, but far enough to give him a clear field of view across the surrounding terrain. As he prepared to move out into the storm, James couldn't shake the image of Samuel Porter's final moments from his mind. Samuel David Porter had been more than just a fellow soldier to the men and women of his unit. During their training exercises, he had demonstrated a natural leadership ability that had earned the respect of his peers and superiors alike. His father's experience as a park ranger had given Samuel an intuitive understanding of wildlife behavior, and his mother's medical background had made him an effective field medic when Alexandra wasn't available. Now, Samuel was dead, his body lying in the snow less than 50 meters from where his friends were fighting for their own survival. The bear's attack had been swift and brutal, but what haunted the survivors most was the calculated intelligence the animal had displayed. This wasn't a random encounter with a wild animal. It had been a planned assault by a predator that understood human tactics and had adapted its own hunting strategy accordingly. Corporal Thomas Anderson was working to establish a new communications array using salvaged equipment from their destroyed gear. Tom's background in explosives had given him a thorough understanding of electronic systems, and he was methodically testing each component to determine what could be repaired or jury-rigged into working condition. "I think I can get the emergency beacon functional," Tom reported to Elena, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "It won't give us voice communication, but it'll transmit our position and emergency status to any aircraft in the area." The emergency beacon represented their best hope for rescue, but even if it functioned perfectly, there was no guarantee that anyone would receive the signal until the storm passed. The weather conditions that had isolated them from their command base were affecting all air traffic across the Arctic archipelago, grounding rescue aircraft and preventing any immediate response to their situation. As James Mitchell made his way toward the observation ridge, he could see the devastation the bears' attack had wrought on their carefully planned camp. 3 of their 4 Arctic shelters were completely destroyed, their contents scattered across the snow by the animals' rampage. Supply containers had been overturned and their contents strewn about, some items already buried by the accumulating snow. But what disturbed James most were the tracks. Even in the driving snow, he could see clear evidence of the bears' movements through their camp. The animal had moved with purpose and intelligence, selecting specific targets and using available cover to maximum advantage. The tracks showed that the bear had approached from multiple directions during its reconnaissance, studying their defenses and identifying weak points before launching its attack. More troubling still were the additional tracks James discovered as he reached his observation position. The massive paw prints showed that the bear had returned to the camp perimeter at least twice since the initial attack, circling their position and observing their response to the casualties. The animal was still hunting them, waiting for the right moment to strike again. At 4:23 a.m., James's worst fears were confirmed when he spotted movement on the northwestern horizon. Through his night vision scope, he could see a massive white shape moving deliberately toward their position. The bear was returning, and this time it was approaching from upwind, using the storm to mask its scent and muffle the sound of its movement. "Contact, northwest, 800 meters and closing," James radioed to the camp. "It's coming back." Eleanor felt her blood run cold as she received the report. With Jennifer Watson critically injured and their defensive positions compromised, they were in no condition to withstand another sustained attack. Their ammunition was running low, and the storm was preventing any possibility of evacuation or reinforcement. "All positions prepare for contact," Eleanor ordered. "This time we make our shots count." Alexandra looked up from her patient with desperation in her eyes. "I can't move her," she said. "Any significant movement will kill her instantly." The tactical situation was becoming impossible. They couldn't retreat without abandoning their wounded comrade, but they couldn't defend their current position effectively with their limited resources and compromised defensive perimeter. Elena realized that they were facing a choice no military commander should ever have to make. The bear's approach was methodical and patient. Unlike its previous attack, which had been swift and overwhelming, the animal was now taking its time, probing their defenses and looking for weaknesses. James tracked its movement through his scope, watching as the massive predator used every available piece of cover to mask its advance. At 4:31 a.m., the bear stopped approximately 400 meters from their position and simply waited. Through his scope, James could see the animal sitting motionless in the snow, its black eyes reflecting the scattered light from their camp. It was studying them, learning their patterns and preparing for its next move. "What's it doing?" Bobby Williams asked over the radio, his voice tight with nervous tension. "It's thinking," James replied, and the implications of that statement sent chills down the spines of every soldier in the unit. The psychological warfare was as effective as any physical attack. Knowing that 800 pounds of intelligent predator was watching them, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, was wearing down their nerves and exhausting their emotional reserves. The bear had learned that humans were most vulnerable when they were tired, stressed, and making poor decisions. At 4:47 a.m., The animal's patience was rewarded. David Kim, exhausted from his attempts to repair their communications equipment, made a critical error. He left the protective cover of their shelter to retrieve a component from one of the destroyed supply containers, exposing himself in open ground for nearly 30 seconds. The bear's response was immediate and devastating. It covered the 400 meters between its position and David's location in less than 40 seconds, moving with the fluid grace of a natural predator despite its massive size. David had just enough time to look up and see death approaching before 800 pounds of Arctic carnivore slammed into him like a freight train. James Mitchell had a clear shot as the bear closed the distance, but the angle made it impossible to fire without risking hitting David. He watched in helpless fury as another of his friends was taken down by the massive predator, powerless to intervene without making the situation worse. The bear's attack on David Kim was even more brutal than its previous assaults. The animal seemed to understand that David was the key to their communications capability, and it methodically destroyed not only the soldier, but also the equipment he had been working to repair. David's screams echoed across the camp for nearly a minute before they were suddenly cut short. "Take the shot!" Elena screamed over the radio, but James's position no longer provided a clear field of fire. The bear had positioned itself behind the wreckage of their equipment, using their own gear as a shield while it finished its grisly work. When the bear finally moved away from David's motionless form, it carried with it the last of their hope for immediate rescue. The communications equipment was completely destroyed, leaving them with no way to contact the outside world until the storm passed and aircraft could reach their position. The attack had lasted less than 5 minutes, but it had effectively eliminated their ability to call for help and reduced their numbers to 7 effective soldiers. With Jennifer Watson still critically injured and David Kim dead, they were facing an increasingly desperate situation with dwindling resources and a predator that seemed to anticipate their every move. As dawn approached on September 9th, the storm finally began to show signs of weakening. The wind dropped from a howling gale to a steady blow, and the snow changed from driving horizontal sheets to heavy but manageable flakes. For the first time in over 6 hours, visibility improved to the point where they could see more than a few meters in any direction. The improved conditions revealed the full extent of the devastation. Their camp looked like a war zone, with destroyed equipment scattered across an area of nearly 200 square meters. Bloodstains in the snow marked the locations where their friends had died, and the massive tracks of the polar bear crisscrossed the entire area like the signature of some malevolent force. But the most chilling discovery came when James Mitchell used his scope to survey the surrounding terrain in the growing light. The bear hadn't left the area. It was positioned on a ridge approximately 600 meters to the northeast, clearly visible against the white landscape, watching their every move with the patience of a predator that knew time was on its side. At 6:15 a.m., Thomas Anderson managed to get their emergency beacon operational using salvaged components and a jury-rigged power supply. The device began transmitting their position and emergency status on standard rescue frequencies. But with no way to know if anyone was receiving the signal, they could only hope that help was on the way. The beacon's activation seemed to trigger a response from the bear. The massive animal stood up on its hind legs, rising to its full height of nearly 8 feet, and surveyed their camp with obvious intelligence. It was clear that the bear understood the significance of the electronic signals emanating from their position. "It knows," Lisa Chen said quietly, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and terror. "It knows we're calling for help." The bear's behavior over the next several hours confirmed Lisa's assessment. The animal began to patrol a wide circle around their position, staying just outside effective rifle range, but close enough to observe their activities. It was clear that the bear was waiting for something, possibly the arrival of rescue aircraft that it could attack before they could land. At 8:43 a.m., their emergency beacon received an automated response, indicating that their distress signal had been received by a military monitoring station in Yellowknife. The message included an estimated time of arrival for rescue aircraft of approximately 4 hours, depending on weather conditions at the departure airfield. 4 hours. They had to survive 4 more hours with a wounded soldier, limited ammunition, and an 800-pound predator that had already killed 2 of their friends and seemed to understand their situation better than any wild animal should. Elena made the decision to conserve their ammunition and avoid any unnecessary confrontation with the bear until rescue arrived. They would maintain their defensive positions and monitor the animal's movements, but they would not initiate contact unless directly threatened. It was a strategy born of desperation, but it represented their best chance of survival until help arrived. Jennifer Watson's condition continued to deteriorate despite Alexandra's heroic efforts to keep her alive. The combination of massive internal injuries, exposure to extreme cold, and shock was taking its toll, and Alex could see that her friend was slowly dying. Without immediate surgical intervention and advanced life support, Jen would not survive the day. The bear seemed to sense the weakening condition of the wounded soldier. Throughout the morning, it gradually moved closer to their position, testing their responses and probing for signs of weakness. The animal's intelligence was becoming increasingly apparent as it adapted its tactics based on their reactions to its movements. At 10:22 a.m., the psychological pressure finally broke one of the soldiers. Private Robert Williams, exhausted and traumatized by the deaths of his friends, made an impulsive decision to engage the bear with his rifle. Bobby left the protective cover of their shelter and advanced toward the animal's position, firing rapidly and shouting challenges. The bear's response was swift and tactical. Instead of charging directly toward Bobby's position, it used the terrain to approach from an unexpected angle, moving through a depression that concealed its advance until it was within 50 meters of the exposed soldier. Bobby realized his mistake too late, and his panicked retreat brought him directly into the bear's preferred killing zone. James Mitchell made a split-second decision that saved Bobby's life, but cost him his own chance at escape. He left his overwatch position and ran directly toward the bear, firing his sniper rifle from the hip and shouting to draw the animal's attention away from Bobby. The tactic worked, but it left James isolated and vulnerable as 800 pounds of apex predator turned its full attention toward him. The final confrontation between James Mitchell and the polar bear was brutal and decisive. James managed to put 3 rounds into the animal's chest before its massive claws raked across his torso, opening wounds that went to the bone. The bear's jaws closed around James's left arm, crushing the bones like kindling and severing arteries that pumped his lifeblood into the snow. But James Mitchell was a warrior, and he refused to die easily. Even as the bear's teeth penetrated deep into his flesh, he managed to draw his sidearm and empty the entire magazine into the animal's skull at point-blank range. The combination of blood loss from his previous wounds and the close-range pistol fire finally began to take its toll on the massive predator. The bear released James and staggered backward, blood flowing from multiple wounds in its head and chest. For a moment, it seemed as though the animal might retreat, but instead it gathered its remaining strength for one final, devastating attack. The bear's massive paw came down on James's chest with enough force to crush his ribcage, driving bone fragments into his lungs and heart. James Mitchell died at 10:34 a.m. on September 9, 2025, but his sacrifice had achieved its objective. The polar bear, mortally wounded and bleeding from multiple gunshot wounds, finally succumbed to its injuries and collapsed less than 20 meters from James's body. The massive predator that had terrorized them throughout the night was dead, but the cost had been terrible. Of the 12 soldiers who had begun Operation Arctic Shield, only 6 remained alive, and one of those was critically injured and dying. Samuel Porter, David Kim, and James Mitchell were dead, killed by an animal that had demonstrated tactical intelligence beyond anything in their training or experience. The survivors were traumatized, exhausted, and running dangerously low on supplies. At 12:47 p.m., the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors cut through the Arctic air like a symphony of salvation. 2 Canadian Armed Forces CH-149 Cormorant helicopters approached from the southeast, their crews already briefed on the emergency situation and prepared for immediate medical evacuation. The lead helicopter, callsign Rescue 41, was piloted by Major Patricia Holbrook, a veteran search and rescue pilot with over 15 years of experience in Arctic operations. Her crew included Flight Engineer Master Warrant Officer Kevin Murphy, Search and Rescue Technician Sergeant Michael Thompson, and Flight Medic Corporal Lisa Richardson. As Rescue 41 approached the devastated campsite, the full scope of the disaster became apparent to the aircrew. The scattered equipment, destroyed shelters, and obvious signs of violence painted a clear picture of what had occurred during the long Arctic night. "Jesus Christ," Murphy muttered as he surveyed the scene through his window. "It looks like a war zone down there." Major Holbrook had seen combat zones in Afghanistan and understood the difference between human violence and animal attacks. But the destruction below was unlike anything in her experience. The systematic nature of the damage suggested an intelligence and purpose that was deeply disturbing. The first priority was medical evacuation of the critically injured soldier. Sergeant Thompson rappelled down to the camp and immediately began coordinating with Alexandra to prepare Jennifer Watson for transport. Jen was unconscious and barely breathing, her vital signs weak and erratic. "We need to get her to a trauma center immediately," Thompson reported to the aircraft. "She's got massive internal injuries and she's going into shock." The medical evacuation proceeded with military precision, but the remote location of the camp and the severity of Jen's injuries meant that even the most rapid transport would take nearly 3 hours to reach the nearest hospital capable of handling her trauma. Time was running out for the wounded soldier. As Jennifer Watson was loaded aboard Rescue 41 for immediate transport to the trauma center in Yellowknife, the second helicopter, Rescue 42, landed to evacuate the remaining survivors. The pilot, Captain Sarah Mackenzie, was accompanied by a team that included a military investigator and a wildlife specialist who would begin the preliminary investigation into the attack. The survivors' accounts of the bear attack were consistent but almost unbelievable. The animal had demonstrated tactical intelligence, patience, and adaptability that challenged everything the experts thought they knew about polar bear behavior. The systematic nature of the attack and the bear's apparent understanding of human technology and tactics suggested something far beyond normal animal instincts. Captain Robert Bear Davis, the military's leading expert on Arctic wildlife, examined the massive carcass of the polar bear with growing amazement. The animal was larger than any polar bear he had encountered in 20 years of Arctic service, and the pattern of its attacks suggested a level of cognitive ability that was scientifically fascinating and terrifying. This bear had previous contact with humans, Davis concluded after examining the animal's scars and behavior patterns. Probably military personnel, based on its tactical responses. It learned how we operate and adapted its hunting strategy accordingly. The implications were staggering. If polar bears could learn and adapt to human military tactics, it fundamentally changed the threat assessment for all future Arctic operations. The attack on Operation Arctic Shield might be the first documented case of what could become a much larger problem as climate change drove more human-bear interactions in the Arctic. The evacuation of the survivors was completed by 2:15 p.m., but the investigation into the attack would continue for months. The bodies of Samuel Porter, David Kim, and James Mitchell were recovered and transported to the military morgue in Edmonton for autopsy and forensic examination. The bear's carcass was also transported for detailed study by wildlife biologists and veterinary pathologists. Dr. Elizabeth Cameron, the Chief of Emergency Medicine at Stanton Territorial Hospital in Yellowknife, was waiting in Trauma Bay 1 when Rescue 41 arrived with Jennifer Watson. Elizabeth had 22 years of experience in emergency medicine, including deployments with Doctors Without Borders in conflict zones, but the extent of Jen's injuries challenged even her considerable skills. Patient is a 22-year-old female soldier with massive chest trauma from animal attack, the flight medic reported as they transferred Jen to the trauma table. Multiple rib fractures, probable internal bleeding and crush injuries to the thoracic cavity. Blood pressure is dropping and respiratory function is severely compromised. Dr. Cameron's initial examination revealed the true extent of the damage. The bear's massive jaws had crushed Jennifer's ribcage like an eggshell, driving bone fragments into her lungs, heart, and major blood vessels. Her left lung had collapsed completely, and internal bleeding was filling her chest cavity with blood. "We need to get her to surgery immediately," Dr. C. Cameron ordered. "Page Dr. Harrison and tell him we have a priority trauma coming up, and get 4 units of O-negative blood ready for transfusion." Dr. Michael Harrison, the hospital's chief thoracic surgeon, was already scrubbing in when Jennifer Watson arrived in operating room 2. Michael had performed thousands of surgical procedures during his career, but the combination of trauma and extreme hypothermia presented unique challenges that would test his skills to the limit. The surgery lasted over 6 hours as Dr. Harrison and his team worked to repair the massive damage to Jennifer's chest cavity. They removed over 2 liters of blood from her chest, repaired a lacerated lung, and used titanium plates to reconstruct her shattered ribcage. The surgical team fought for every heartbeat, but Jennifer Watson's injuries were simply too severe for her body to overcome. Jennifer Watson died at 8:43 p.m. on September 9, 2025, despite the heroic efforts of the medical team. The cause of death was listed as massive internal trauma resulting from animal attack, but everyone involved understood that she had been killed by a predator unlike any they had encountered before. The news of the 4th fatality from Operation Arctic Shield sent shockwaves through the Canadian Armed Forces and the broader Arctic community. What had begun as a routine training exercise had become one of the deadliest animal attacks in Canadian military history, and the implications for future Arctic operations were profound. Major General Patricia Williams, commander of the Canadian Army's Arctic Division, ordered a comprehensive review of all Arctic training protocols and wildlife encounter procedures. The attack had revealed critical gaps in their understanding of polar bear behavior and their preparedness for intelligent predator encounters. The surviving soldiers were transported to CFB Edmonton for medical evaluation and psychological counseling. The trauma of watching their friends die in such a brutal manner had left deep psychological scars that would require months or years of treatment. Post-traumatic stress disorder was a virtual certainty for all the survivors, and some would never fully recover from their ordeal. Sergeant Major Elena Rodriguez was placed on administrative leave pending the completion of the official investigation. As the expedition leader, she bore ultimate responsibility for the safety of her soldiers, and the loss of 4 members of her unit would haunt her for the rest of her life. Elena had survived 3 combat deployments without losing a single soldier under her command, and the bear attack represented a devastating failure that challenged her sense of professional competence. Dr. Sarah McKinnon, the military's chief psychologist, began conducting interviews with the survivors within hours of their evacuation. Sarah specialized in combat trauma and had extensive experience treating soldiers suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, but the nature of the bear attack presented unique psychological challenges. The soldiers are exhibiting classic symptoms of extreme trauma, Dr. McKinnon reported to the commanding general. Hypervigilance, sleep disturbances, intrusive memories, and survivor guilt. But there's an additional element here. They're struggling with the intelligence the bear displayed. It challenges their fundamental understanding of predator-prey relationships and makes them question their ability to assess and respond to threats. The psychological impact extended beyond the immediate survivors. Word of the attack spread rapidly through the military community, and soldiers throughout the Arctic Command began requesting transfers to warmer climates. The idea that an animal could outthink and outmaneuver trained soldiers was profoundly disturbing to personnel who had always relied on their technological and tactical superiority. The official investigation into the attack was led by Colonel James Robertson, a veteran officer with extensive experience in military accident investigation. Robertson assembled a team that included wildlife biologists, military tacticians, and forensic specialists to conduct the most comprehensive analysis possible of the events leading up to and during the attack. The investigation team arrived at the attack site on September 11th, 2 days after the incident. The scene had been preserved as much as possible, with the bear's carcass and the soldiers' equipment left in place for detailed examination. Crime scene investigators worked methodically to document every aspect of the attack, creating a detailed reconstruction of the bear's movements and tactics. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a wildlife biologist from the University of Alaska, was brought in to analyze the bear's behavior patterns. Jennifer had spent 15 years studying polar bear behavior in the wild, but the evidence from the attack site challenged everything she thought she knew about the species. This bear demonstrated problem-solving abilities that are unprecedented in the literature, Dr. Walsh reported to the investigation team. The systematic approach to destroying the motion sensors, the use of terrain and weather for tactical advantage, and the apparent understanding of human technology all suggest cognitive abilities that exceed our current understanding of polar bear intelligence. The forensic examination of the bear's carcass revealed additional disturbing information. The animal bore multiple old scars that appeared to be from previous encounters with humans, including what looked like bullet wounds that had healed over time. The bear had learned from previous confrontations and had developed specific strategies for dealing with armed humans. More troubling still was the discovery of human remains in the bear's digestive system. DNA analysis would later confirm that the remains belonged to 3 different individuals, none of whom were members of Operation Arctic Shield. The bear had been killing and eating humans for months, possibly years, before encountering the military training exercise. The media response to the attack was immediate and intense. The story of Canadian soldiers being systematically hunted and killed by an intelligent polar bear captured public attention across North America and around the world. News crews descended on Yellowknife and Edmonton, seeking interviews with survivors and expert analysis of the unprecedented attack. CBC News correspondent David Mitchell was the first journalist to report on the story, broadcasting live from outside Stanton Territorial Hospital, where Jennifer Watson had been treated. David's initial report focused on the heroic efforts of the medical team, but subsequent coverage delved into the disturbing implications of the bear's behavior. This was not a typical animal attack, David reported during the evening news on September 10th. According to military sources, the polar bear demonstrated tactical intelligence that allowed it to systematically hunt and kill trained soldiers who were armed with military weapons. The implications for Arctic operations and human safety in polar bear territory are profound. The story was picked up by major news networks across North America and Europe. CNN, Fox News, BBC, and dozens of other outlets ran extensive coverage of the attack, often focusing on the most sensational aspects of the story. The idea of a killer bear that could outthink human soldiers made for compelling television, but the coverage often lacked the nuance necessary to understand the broader implications of the incident. Dr. Polar bear specialist Ian Sterling from the University of Alberta became the go-to expert for media interviews about the attack. Ian had spent over 40 years studying polar bears and was one of the world's leading authorities on the species, but even he was struggling to explain the behavior patterns described by the survivors. Polar bears are highly intelligent animals, Ian explained during a televised interview. They're capable of complex problem-solving and have been observed using tools in the wild. But the level of tactical thinking described in this attack goes beyond anything we've documented in the scientific literature. The public reaction to the story was a mixture of fascination and terror. Social media exploded with discussion about the attack, with many people expressing disbelief that any animal could demonstrate such sophisticated hunting strategies. Others pointed to the incident as evidence that climate change was driving desperate polar bears to become increasingly aggressive toward humans. Environmental groups seized on the story as an example of what could happen as polar bear habitat continued to shrink due to global warming. The World Wildlife Fund issued a statement linking the attack to climate change and calling for increased conservation efforts to protect polar bear populations and reduce human-bear conflicts. This tragic incident highlights the desperate situation facing polar bears as their Arctic habitat disappears, the WWF statement read. As sea ice continues to decline, polar bears are being forced into increased contact with humans, leading to conflicts that are deadly for both species. But wildlife experts cautioned against drawing too direct a link between climate change and the specific behavior patterns observed in the attack. The bear's systematic hunting strategy and apparent understanding of human technology suggested something beyond simple hunger or desperation. The families of the dead soldiers were struggling to cope with their devastating losses while being besieged by media attention. Samuel Porter's parents, Michael and Catherine, were particularly targeted by reporters seeking to understand their son's background and the circumstances that led to his death. Michael Porter, speaking from the family home in Fredericton, New Brunswick, expressed his grief and anger over his son's death. Samuel loved the outdoors and respected wildlife, Michael said. He would never have wanted his death to be used to demonize polar bears or to justify hunting them. He understood that humans are the intruders in the Arctic, not the bears. Catherine Porter, still in shock from the loss of her youngest child, struggled to comprehend how an animal could have killed her well-trained, well-armed son. The military told us that polar bears are dangerous, but they said the soldiers were prepared for wildlife encounters, she said. How could they be prepared for something like this? The funeral services for the 3 dead soldiers were held simultaneously on September 15th in their respective hometowns. Samuel Porter was buried in the Fredericton Rural Cemetery with full military honors and an honor guard from his regiment. David Kim was laid to rest in the Mountain View Cemetery in Vancouver, and James Mitchell was buried in the Union Cemetery in Calgary. Each funeral was attended by hundreds of mourners, including fellow soldiers, family members, and members of the public who had been deeply moved by the story of their deaths. The eulogies focused on the soldiers' dedication to service and their ultimate sacrifice in defense of their country, but there was an underlying question that no one wanted to address directly. How could trained soldiers be defeated by a single animal? The psychological impact of the funerals extended to the surviving soldiers, all of whom attended their friends' services despite their own ongoing trauma. Watching their comrades being lowered into the ground while knowing they could have easily been in those caskets themselves was a devastating experience that set back their recovery significantly. Master Corporal Lisa Chen was hospitalized twice in the weeks following the attack for severe anxiety attacks that left her unable to breathe or function normally. Lisa had always prided herself on her analytical abilities and her capacity to stay calm under pressure. But the bear attack had shattered her confidence in her ability to assess and respond to threats. Corporal Thomas Anderson began drinking heavily within days of returning from the Arctic, using alcohol to numb the memories of watching his friends die. Tom's family staged an intervention 3 weeks after the attack, but his response to treatment was complicated by his conviction that he should have done more to save his comrades. Private Robert Williams suffered from severe insomnia and recurring nightmares that made it impossible for him to function in his military duties. Bobby was placed on medical leave and referred to a specialist in combat trauma. But his recovery was complicated by survivor guilt and his conviction that he was responsible for James Mitchell's death. The surviving soldiers were all diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, but their specific symptoms varied based on their individual experiences during the attack. Some suffered from hypervigilance and exaggerated startle responses, while others experienced dissociative episodes where they felt disconnected from their surroundings. Dr. Sarah McKinnon worked with each survivor individually to develop treatment plans tailored to their specific needs. The therapy combined traditional PTSD treatment techniques with specialized approaches for dealing with animal attack trauma and survivor guilt. The soldiers are struggling with several interconnected issues, Dr. McKinnon explained to their commanding officers. They're dealing with the trauma of watching their friends die, the guilt of surviving when others didn't, and the fundamental challenge to their worldview represented by the bear's intelligence. Traditional combat PTSD treatment protocols need to be modified to address these unique aspects. The investigation into the attack continued for months, with teams of specialists examining every aspect of the incident from multiple perspectives. Wildlife biologists studied the bear's behavior patterns. Military analysts examined the tactical decisions made by the soldiers, and forensic specialists reconstructed the timeline of events with minute precision. The final report, released 6 months after the attack, concluded that the soldiers had followed proper procedures and had responded appropriately to the threat they faced. The bear's extraordinary intelligence and adaptability had simply exceeded the parameters of their training and equipment, creating a situation that was effectively unwinnable given the resources available to them. The soldiers of Operation Arctic Shield faced an unprecedented threat that challenged our fundamental understanding of predator behavior, the report concluded. Their courage and professionalism in the face of this threat was exemplary, and their sacrifice will contribute to improved safety protocols for future Arctic operations. The report included dozens of recommendations for improving Arctic training and wildlife encounter procedures. Motion sensor technology was upgraded to be more resistant to animal interference. Communication systems were redesigned to function better in extreme weather conditions, and new protocols were developed for dealing with intelligent predator encounters. But perhaps the most significant change was the development of new psychological preparation programs designed to help soldiers cope with the possibility of encountering wildlife that demonstrated human-like intelligence. The bear attack had revealed that traditional predator-prey assumptions could be dangerously inadequate in certain circumstances. The scientific study of the bear's remains provided additional insights into the animal's extraordinary behavior. Brain imaging revealed an unusually large prefrontal cortex, the region associated with complex problem-solving and strategic thinking. Genetic analysis showed that the bear belonged to a subpopulation that had been isolated from the main polar bear population for several generations, possibly allowing for the evolution of enhanced cognitive abilities. Dr. Jennifer Walsh published her findings in the Journal of Arctic Biology, contributing to a growing body of research on polar bear intelligence and adaptability. Her work suggested that climate change might be selecting for more intelligent bears as the animals were forced to adapt to rapidly changing environmental conditions. The bear that killed these soldiers may represent an evolutionary adaptation to increasing human presence in the Arctic, Dr. Walsh wrote. As polar bears are forced into more frequent contact with humans, natural selection may favor individuals with enhanced cognitive abilities and problem-solving skills. The implications of this research extended far beyond the immediate tragedy of Operation Arctic Shield. If polar bears were evolving to become more intelligent and better adapted to dealing with humans, it could fundamentally change the relationship between the two species in the Arctic. 1 year after the attack, a memorial was erected at CFB Edmonton, honoring the 4 soldiers who died during Operation Arctic Shield. The memorial consists of 4 bronze plaques mounted on a granite monument, each bearing the name, photograph, and service record of the fallen soldiers. The memorial service was attended by over 2,000 people, including the families of the dead soldiers, their surviving comrades, and military personnel from across Canada. Major General Patricia Williams spoke about the soldiers' sacrifice and their contribution to Arctic security, but her words carried an underlying acknowledgement that their deaths had revealed fundamental gaps in military preparedness for Arctic operations. The surviving soldiers attended the memorial service, though all were still struggling with the long-term effects of their trauma. Elena Rodriguez had been medically retired from the military due to her inability to function effectively in command positions. The bear attack had destroyed her confidence in her ability to keep her soldiers safe, and she was unable to overcome the guilt of losing 4 members of her unit. The families of the dead soldiers found some comfort in the memorial, but their grief remained fresh and overwhelming. Sarah Mitchell, Samuel Porter's girlfriend, spoke about his dedication to service and his love for the Canadian wilderness, but she also expressed anger at the military's failure to adequately prepare him for the threat he faced. Samuel trusted the military to give him the training and equipment he needed to survive, Sarah said during the memorial service. He died because they didn't understand the enemy he was facing. How many more soldiers will die before they figure out how to protect them? The question hung in the air like an accusation, and military leaders struggled to provide adequate answers. The truth was that the bear attack had revealed the limits of human knowledge and preparedness in the face of an evolving natural world. 2 years after the attack, polar bear encounters with humans in the Arctic increased dramatically. Climate change continued to reduce sea ice habitat, forcing more bears into contact with human settlements and activities. Several attacks occurred that showed similar patterns of intelligent, tactical behavior, though none approached the systematic nature of the Operation Arctic Shield incident. The Canadian Armed Forces implemented comprehensive changes to their Arctic training protocols based on the lessons learned from the bear attack. All soldiers deployed to polar bear territory now received extensive training in wildlife encounter procedures, carry enhanced communications equipment, and operate under strict buddy system protocols designed to prevent isolation and ambush. New technologies were developed specifically for Arctic operations, including improved motion sensors, enhanced cold weather communication systems, and specialized wildlife deterrent devices. The military also established partnerships with wildlife biologists and polar bear specialists to provide ongoing consultation for Arctic operations. But despite these improvements, the fundamental challenge remained unchanged. As climate change continued to alter the Arctic environment, both humans and polar bears were being forced to adapt to new conditions and new patterns of interaction. The bear that killed 4 Canadian soldiers had demonstrated that this adaptation could take forms that challenged humanity's assumptions about the natural world. The story of Operation Arctic Shield became a case study in military training programs around the world, illustrating the importance of preparing for unexpected threats and the dangers of underestimating wildlife intelligence. But it also served as a sobering reminder that humans were not always the apex predators they assumed themselves to be. In the vast wilderness of the Canadian Arctic, where the aurora borealis dances across star-filled skies and the wind carries the songs of ancient ice, the memory of Samuel Porter, David Kim, James Mitchell and Jennifer Watson lives on. They died facing an enemy unlike any their training had prepared them for, but their sacrifice contributed to a greater understanding of the changing relationship between humans and the natural world. The polar bear that killed them was a creature shaped by millions of years of evolution and decades of human contact. A predator that had learned to think like its prey, while retaining all the physical advantages that made it one of nature's most formidable killers. In death, it became a symbol of the changing Arctic and the new challenges facing humanity in a world transformed by climate change. The families, friends and fellow soldiers who mourned the 4 victims of Operation Arctic Shield carried forward their memory and their commitment to service. But they also carried forward the knowledge that the natural world was capable of surprises that could challenge humanity's most fundamental assumptions about survival, intelligence, and the relationship between predator and prey. In the end, the bear attack that shocked the world and changed military protocol forever served as a reminder that nature still held mysteries and dangers that human knowledge and technology could not always overcome. The soldiers who died that September night in the Arctic gave their lives not in combat against human enemies, but in a confrontation with the wild intelligence of a changing natural world. Their story became a testament to both human courage and human vulnerability, a reminder that even the best training and equipment could not guarantee survival when facing an enemy that thought, learned, and adapted with the patience and cunning of millions of years of evolutionary refinement. The polar bear that killed them was not just an animal acting on instinct, but a thinking adversary that had studied its prey and planned its attack with the precision of a military strategist. The legacy of Operation Arctic Shield extended far beyond the immediate tragedy of 4 young lives lost. It marked a turning point in humanity's understanding of its relationship with the natural world and the recognition that climate change was creating new forms of conflict that challenged traditional assumptions about human dominance over the environment. As the Arctic continued to warm and change, as polar bears were forced into increased contact with human activities, and as the natural world adapted to unprecedented environmental pressures, the story of what happened during those terrible hours in September 2025 served as both a warning and a tribute to the courage of those who ventured into the unknown in service of their country. The wind still howls across the barren landscape of Resolute Bay, carrying with it the scent of ice, death, and change. But now it also carries the memory of 4 soldiers who faced the ultimate test of their training and courage, and who died, proving that in the vast wilderness of the Arctic, humanity was not always the hunter, and nature still held the power to surprise, terrify, and humble even the most prepared and determined representatives of human civilization. The next stories. September 10th, 2024, grizzly destroys family's SUV, kills father of 3 in Montana. The morning sun cast long shadows across Flathead Lake as James Collins adjusted the rearview mirror of his silver Toyota 4Runner, catching a glimpse of his 3 children in the back seat. Emma, his 15-year-old daughter, was absorbed in her phone despite the stunning Montana wilderness stretching beyond her window. 12-year-old Marcus had his face pressed against the glass, pointing excitedly at every deer or elk they passed, while 8-year-old Sophie clutched her stuffed bear, an ironic companion that would haunt the family's memories for years to come. "Dad, how much further?" Emma asked without looking up from her screen, her voice carrying that particular teenage inflection that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else. James exchanged a knowing glance with his wife, Sarah, who sat beside him with a detailed map of Glacier National Park spread across her lap. At 36, Sarah had the kind of outdoorsy beauty that came from years of hiking and camping. Her auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, freckles scattered across her nose from countless hours in the sun. She wore a fleece jacket over a moisture-wicking shirt, prepared for the variable September weather that could shift from warm sunshine to sudden mountain storms. "About 20 more minutes, sweetheart," James replied, his voice warm with the kind of patience that came from being a father for 15 years. At 38, James Collins was a man built for the outdoors, 6 feet tall with broad shoulders, earned from years of weekend construction projects and regular gym sessions. His brown hair was beginning to show streaks of grey at the temples, and laugh lines crinkled around his blue eyes when he smiled. He worked as an electrical engineer for a power company in Missoula, but his true passion lay in sharing Montana's wilderness with his family. "I can see why they call it Big Sky Country," Sarah murmured, studying the landscape with the keen eye of someone who had grown up in the relative flatlands of Nebraska. She had moved to Montana 12 years ago when James was transferred to the Missoula office, and she had fallen in love with both the man and the majestic landscape he called home. The family had been planning this camping trip for months. James had researched the perfect spot near Flathead Lake, away from the crowded campgrounds but still accessible enough for the children. He had found a dispersed camping area on Forest Service land, tucked into a grove of towering ponderosa pines and Douglas fir trees, with a small clearing that would accommodate their tent and provide a perfect view of the lake below. Marcus pressed his nose against the window again, his breath fogging the glass. "Is that where we're going to camp?" he asked, pointing toward a heavily forested slope that descended toward the sparkling blue waters of Flathead Lake. "Close," James said, consulting the GPS coordinates he had marked on his phone. "We're heading to a spot about half a mile up from the lake. It's supposed to have an incredible view and direct access to some great hiking trails." The Forerunner wound its way along Highway 35, following the eastern shore of Flathead Lake. The lake stretched for 31 miles, making it the largest natural freshwater lake west of the Mississippi River. The water was a brilliant blue under the late morning sun, dotted with sailboats and fishing vessels. Dense forests of lodgepole pine, western larch, and Engelmann spruce covered the surrounding mountains, their peaks disappearing into wisps of white clouds. As they turned onto Forest Service Road 618, the pavement gave way to gravel, and the Forerunner began to climb steadily through increasingly dense forest. James had chosen this particular area because it was known for its wildlife viewing opportunities. Mountain goats, elk, deer, and black bears were commonly spotted. He had done his research on bear safety, packing bear spray and a bear canister for their food storage. What he didn't know was that the area had seen increased grizzly bear activity in recent weeks, as drought conditions in the higher elevations had driven the massive predators down to lower altitudes in search of food. "Look at those trees," Sophie whispered in awe, her 8-year-old mind struggling to comprehend the sheer scale of the forest giants surrounding them. Some of the ponderosa pines were over 200 feet tall and more than 4 feet in diameter, ancient sentinels that had stood for centuries. Sarah folded her map and reached back to pat Sophie's knee. "Pretty amazing, isn't it? Your dad picked a perfect spot for us." The gravel road climbed steadily, switching back and forth through the forest. They passed a few other vehicles, a pickup truck with Montana plates heading down the mountain, and a small camping trailer parked at a turnout where a family was setting up what appeared to be a day camp. James waved at the father, a gesture of mountain courtesy that was returned with a friendly nod. "Cell service is getting pretty spotty up here," Emma observed, finally looking up from her phone with a mixture of annoyance and resignation. "That's the point," James said with a grin. "Sometimes it's good to disconnect from the digital world and connect with the natural one." Emma rolled her eyes but smiled despite herself. She had inherited her father's love of the outdoors, though she was at an age where admitting such things felt uncool. She'd been looking forward to this trip more than she let on, remembering previous family camping adventures where she had felt truly free from the social pressures and constant connectivity of teenage life. After another 10 minutes of driving, James spotted the turnoff he had been looking for, a narrow dirt track that led into the trees, marked only by a small brown sign that read, "Dispersed camping, pack it in, pack it out." The track was barely wide enough for the 4Runner, with overhanging branches scraping against the roof and windows as they slowly made their way deeper into the forest. The track ended in a small circular clearing, approximately 50 feet in diameter, surrounded by towering trees whose canopy filtered the sunlight into dancing patterns of light and shadow. Through gaps in the trees, they could see glimpses of Flathead Lake sparkling far below, and beyond that, the snow-capped peaks of the Mission Mountains. "This is perfect," Sarah breathed, stepping out of the vehicle and stretching her arms above her head. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine resin and the faint, earthy smell of decomposing leaves. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant call of a loon on the lake below and the rustle of wind through the pine needles overhead. James began unloading their gear with the methodical efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. They had brought a large family tent, sleeping bags rated for temperatures down to 20 degrees, a camp stove, coolers full of food, and all the necessary equipment for a comfortable 3-day camping experience. He had also packed bear spray, rope for hanging their food, and a detailed topographic map of the area. "Okay, everyone knows the drill," James announced as the family gathered around the back of the 4Runner. "Sophie and Emma, you're in charge of setting up the camp chairs and organizing the cooking area. Marcus, you help me get the tent set up. Sarah, want to scout out the best spot for our fire ring?" The family had developed these camping routines over years of trips together. James believed in teaching his children to be self-sufficient in the outdoors, and each family member had specific responsibilities. Even 8-year-old Sophie knew how to properly organize gear and check for level ground when setting up camp. As they worked, James couldn't shake a vague feeling of unease that had settled over him as they drove up the mountain. It was nothing he could pinpoint. The forest seemed peaceful enough, and they had seen no signs of dangerous wildlife, but something felt different about this place. A subtle wrongness that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up whenever he paused in his work. The feeling had started when they turned onto the dirt track leading to their campsite. James had noticed that the forest seemed unusually quiet. No bird songs, no chattering of squirrels, none of the typical sounds he associated with healthy woodland ecosystems. He told himself he was being paranoid, that it was probably just the elevation or time of day affecting wildlife activity. What James didn't know was that less than a quarter mile from their campsite, a massive grizzly bear had established a daybed in a dense thicket of huckleberry bushes. The bear, a male weighing approximately 700 pounds, had been driven down from his normal high-elevation territory by an unusually dry summer that had reduced the availability of whitebark pine nuts, a critical food source for grizzlies preparing for winter hibernation. The bear had been in the area for 3 days, feeding on the last of the season's huckleberries and hunting for any available protein sources. He was entering the hyperphagic phase of his annual cycle, a period when grizzlies must consume up to 20,000 calories per day to build the fat reserves necessary for winter survival. This biological imperative made him more aggressive and less likely to avoid human contact than he might be during other times of the year. Local wildlife officials were aware of increased grizzly activity in the area, but communication between agencies had broken down, and no warnings had been posted at the campsite access points. A trail camera located 2 miles away had captured images of the massive bear 3 days earlier, but the data wouldn't be downloaded and reviewed for another week. As the Collins family went about setting up their camp, the grizzly was approximately 400 yards away, hidden in dense cover but fully aware of their presence. Bears have an extraordinary sense of smell, 7 times better than a bloodhound's, and the wind was carrying the scents of the human family directly to him. The smell of their food, their sunscreen, their soap, and their own human scent created a complex olfactory map that the bear could read as clearly as a human might read a newspaper. "Dad, should we hang the food now or wait until later?" Marcus asked, looking up at the towering trees surrounding their campsite. James followed his son's gaze, assessing the available options for hanging their food well out of reach of any bears. "Let's get camp set up first, then we'll take care of the food storage. Remember, we want it at least 12 feet high and 4 feet out from any tree trunk." The family spent the next 2 hours transforming the small clearing into a comfortable temporary home. The tent went up easily, a spacious 6-person model that would give them plenty of room for their gear and provide adequate space for the family to sleep comfortably. Sarah found the perfect spot for a fire ring, clear of overhanging branches and with good airflow. The camp chairs were arranged in a circle around the fire pit, and a small folding table was set up for food preparation. By early afternoon, they had a well-organized base camp that would have made any outdoor enthusiast proud. James had successfully hung their food and scented items in a tree approximately 50 yards from their tent, using a bear bag technique he had perfected over years of backcountry camping. The bag hung 15 feet off the ground and 6 feet out from the trunk of a large Douglas fir. "Can we go explore now?" Sophie asked, bouncing on her toes with excitement. She had been remarkably patient during the camp setup, but her 8-year-old energy was reaching its limits. "Absolutely," James said, consulting his topographic map. "There's a trail that leads down toward the lake, should be about a mile-round trip, perfect for getting our bearings and stretching our legs." Sarah gathered the children around the map, pointing out their current location and the route they would take. "We stay together at all times," she reminded them. "This is bear country, so we need to make noise as we walk and stay alert." James clipped a canister of bear spray to his belt and made sure Sarah had one as well. He had researched bear encounters extensively and knew that bear spray was statistically more effective than firearms for deterring aggressive bears. The spray created a cone of capsaicin-based irritant that could stop a charging bear at distances up to 30 feet. The family set off down a narrow game trail that wound through the forest toward Flathead Lake. The trail was well worn, but not maintained, requiring them to step over fallen logs and duck under low-hanging branches. James led the way, with the children in the middle, and Sarah bringing up the rear, a formation designed to keep the kids safely between the adults. As they walked, James pointed out various features of the forest ecosystem to his children. He identified different tree species, showed them how to recognize animal tracks in the soft earth, and explained how the various plants and animals depended on each other for survival. This type of outdoor education was one of his greatest joys as a father, sharing his love of nature with the next generation. "Look, deer tracks," Marcus observed, crouching down to examine a set of hoof prints in a muddy section of the trail. Good eye, James said, kneeling beside his son. See how the tracks are pointed? That tells us which direction the deer was traveling. And look at the size. These are probably from a doe, not a buck. Emma hung back slightly, taking pictures with her phone whenever they entered a clearing with enough cell service to auto-back up the images. Despite her teenage protests about wilderness trips, she had a natural eye for photography and genuinely enjoyed documenting their family adventures. What none of them noticed were the much larger tracks that crossed the deer trail about 20 yards ahead of them. The tracks were partially obscured by fallen leaves, but a trained eye would have immediately recognized the distinctive five-toed prints of a large grizzly bear, each track nearly a foot long, including the claw marks that extended several inches beyond the toe pads. The grizzly had crossed this trail early that morning while moving between feeding areas. He had paused briefly at this exact spot, testing the air for scents and listening for any sounds that might indicate danger or opportunity. Bears are incredibly intelligent animals with excellent memory, and he had made a mental note of this location as a potential travel corridor. As the Collins family continued down the trail, they were unknowingly following a path that would bring them within 50 yards of the bear's current location. The wind was shifting constantly through the mountainous terrain, sometimes carrying their scent toward the bear and sometimes carrying it away. During the moments when the wind brought their scent to him, the grizzly would lift his massive head and test the air, his small eyes scanning the forest for movement. The trail began to descend more steeply as they approached the lake, winding through a series of switchbacks that offered occasional glimpses of the sparkling water below. The forest here was different, older and denser, with massive trees that blocked out much of the sunlight and created a cathedral-like atmosphere. "It's so quiet," Sophie whispered, instinctively lowering her voice in the hushed environment. She was right. The forest around them was remarkably still, with none of the bird songs or small animal sounds they had heard earlier in the day. James felt that same unease creeping over him again, a primitive warning system inherited from ancestors who had lived much closer to nature and understood its subtle signals. "Bears are really good at hiding," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice light and educational rather than frightening. "That's why we need to make noise and let them know we're here. Bears usually want to avoid us as much as we want to avoid them." She was repeating advice she had read in numerous camping guides and safety websites, advice that was generally true for black bears but less reliable when dealing with grizzlies, particularly during the fall feeding season when they were aggressively seeking calories and had less tolerance for perceived threats to food sources. As they rounded the next switchback, the trail opened into a small meadow, approximately 50 yards across. The clearing was filled with late-season wildflowers, purple asters, yellow goldenrod, and the last few mountain bluebell blooms. At the far end of the meadow, a small stream trickled down from the forest above, feeding into the lake below. "This is beautiful," Emma said, forgetting her teenage coolness for a moment as she raised her phone to capture the scene. The family spread out slightly as they crossed the meadow, with Sophie running ahead to examine the wildflowers and Marcus investigating the stream. James and Sarah walked more slowly, enjoying the sunshine and the temporary openness after the dense forest. It was Sarah who first noticed the overturned log at the edge of the meadow. Something about it caught her attention. The way the earth around it had been disturbed, the scattered debris that didn't look quite natural. She walked over to investigate and immediately realized what she was looking at. "James," she called quietly, her voice tight with controlled alarm. "Come look at this." The log, which was nearly 3 feet in diameter and probably weighed several hundred pounds, had been flipped over like a pancake. The earth beneath it was churned up, and the surrounding area was scattered with pieces of rotting wood that had been torn apart with tremendous force. Claw marks scored the surface of the log, gouges that were too large and too deep to have been made by any black bear. James examined the scene with growing concern. He had seen evidence of bear activity before, but nothing on this scale. The power required to overturn such a massive log was extraordinary, suggesting a bear of tremendous size and strength. "What is it?" Marcus asked, approaching with Sophie close behind. "A bear was digging for insects here," James said, trying to keep his voice calm and educational. "Bears love to eat grubs and ants, especially in the fall when they're trying to put on weight for winter." He didn't mention that the size of the claw marks and the scale of the disturbance suggested a grizzly bear rather than the smaller black bears that were more common in the area. He also didn't mention that the sign looked recent, probably within the last day or two. "Is the bear still here?" Sophie asked, moving closer to her father and taking his hand. "Probably not," James said, which was technically true. The bear was most likely not in this exact meadow at this exact moment. Bears cover a lot of territory when they're foraging. He's probably miles away by now. But as they stood in the meadow discussing the bear sign, the grizzly was actually less than 100 yards away, concealed in a dense thicket of serviceberry bushes on the far side of the stream. He had heard their voices and caught their scent, and he was now fully alert and focused on the human family in his territory. The bear's behavior at this point was still within normal parameters for a wild grizzly. He was assessing the situation, trying to determine whether these humans represented a threat to him or to any food sources he was defending. His natural inclination was to avoid confrontation, but several factors were working against a peaceful resolution. First, the family was directly downwind from a huckleberry patch that the bear had been feeding in for the past 2 days. In his mind, this was his territory and his food source. Second, he was in the hyperphagic phase of his annual cycle, making him more aggressive and less tolerant of perceived competition. Third, he was a large, dominant male who had never learned to fear humans the way smaller bears might have. The grizzly remained motionless in his concealment, his small, dark eyes fixed on the family as they examined his digging site. His massive head, nearly 3 feet wide, moved slightly as he tested the air for additional scents. His hearing, which was excellent, picked up every word of their conversation. At this moment, if the family had simply turned around and left the meadow, the encounter would likely have ended peacefully. The bear was not yet committed to any course of action, and his natural wariness of humans might have prevailed. But as they lingered in the meadow, and particularly as they moved closer to the stream that bordered his feeding area, the situation became increasingly unstable. "Let's head down to the lake," James decided, eager to move the family away from the area where they had found such obvious signs of recent bear activity. "We can have a snack by the water and then head back to camp." The trail continued past the meadow, following the stream as it tumbled down toward Flathead Lake. The sound of running water masked the normal forest sounds even further, making it impossible to hear the subtle noises that might have warned them of the bear's presence. As they walked along the stream, the grizzly began to move parallel to their path, staying concealed in the dense brush, but maintaining visual contact with the family. This stalking behavior was concerning, as it suggested that the bear was no longer simply monitoring a potential threat, but was actively following them. Bears are incredibly stealthy when they choose to be, despite their massive size. The grizzly weighed approximately 700 pounds and stood 4 feet tall at the shoulder, yet he moved through the forest with surprising grace and silence. His broad paws, equipped with 5-inch claws, found secure footing on fallen logs and rocky outcrops without making a sound. The family reached the shore of Flathead Lake 15 minutes later, emerging from the forest onto a small pebble beach that offered spectacular views across the water. The lake stretched away to the north and south, its surface rippled by a gentle breeze that carried the scent of water and wet stones. "Wow," Marcus breathed, skipping a stone across the calm water near the shore. The lake was indeed spectacular. At this elevation, the water was crystal clear, and they could see trout swimming in the shallows. Across the lake, the Mission Mountains rose in a series of dramatic peaks, their summits capped with early snow that gleamed white against the deep blue sky. James spread out a small tarp on the beach, and Sarah unpacked granola bars and water bottles from her day pack. The family settled in for a rest, enjoying the peaceful setting and the warmth of the afternoon sun. For a few minutes, all seemed perfect with the world. Sophie waded into the shallows, squealing with delight at the cold water and chasing minnows that darted between the rocks. Emma continued taking photographs, finally finding some decent cell service that allowed her to upload a few images to her social media accounts. Marcus explored the shoreline, collecting interesting rocks and pieces of driftwood. None of them noticed the massive brown form that emerged from the forest approximately 50 yards up the beach. The grizzly had followed them to the lake, and now he stood at the edge of the tree line, partially concealed behind a large boulder, but with a clear view of the family. The bear's body language had shifted. Where before he had been cautious and watchful, now his posture showed increasing signs of agitation. His ears were laid back against his massive skull, and his lips were beginning to curl back from his teeth. Most significantly, the hair on his neck and shoulders was starting to stand on end, making him appear even larger and more formidable. Several factors had contributed to this escalation in the bear's stress level. The family had spent considerable time in what he considered his territory. Their presence near the water interfered with his planned route to a fishing spot where he had successfully caught trout the previous evening. Most importantly, the wind had shifted, carrying new scents from the family's camp back at the clearing. The smell of food, cooking equipment, and other items that represented potential resources. The first sign of trouble came when Sophie, playing in the shallows, let out a particularly loud squeal of delight as a fish swam between her feet. The sound carried clearly across the water and into the forest, and the grizzly's head snapped to attention. He took 2 steps forward, moving out from behind the boulder and becoming fully visible to anyone who might be looking in his direction. It was Emma who spotted him first. She had been taking a selfie with the lake in the background when movement in her peripheral vision caught her attention. When she turned to look, her blood went cold. "Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying a tone of pure terror that immediately got James's attention. James followed his daughter's gaze and felt his heart nearly stop. The bear was enormous, far larger than any black bear he had ever seen or imagined. Even at 50 yards, the animal's massive size was obvious. The grizzly stood approximately 4 feet tall at the shoulder while on all fours, but his bulk made him appear even larger. His brown fur was tipped with silver, giving him the grizzled appearance that had given the species its name. For a moment, both the bear and the humans remained perfectly still, each assessing the other. The grizzly's small, dark eyes were fixed on the family, and James could see the animal's massive head moving slightly as he tested the air for scents. "Nobody move," James whispered, reaching slowly for the bear spray clipped to his belt. "Sarah, get Sophie out of the water, slowly." The next few seconds seemed to stretch into an eternity. Sarah began to slowly wade into the shallows towards Sophie, moving with deliberate, non-threatening motions. Marcus, who had been examining rocks 20 feet away, froze in place when he saw the terror on his family's faces. Emma stood motionless, her phone still raised but forgotten. The grizzly watched these movements with increasing agitation. In his experience, most animals fled when they saw him, but these creatures were behaving unpredictably. The small one in the water was making noise and movement, while the larger ones seemed to be positioning themselves in ways that the bear interpreted as potentially threatening. Sarah reached Sophie and gently lifted her out of the water, whispering soothing words while fighting to control her own panic. Sophie, sensing the tension but not understanding its source, allowed herself to be carried back toward the rest of the family. "What do we do?" Sarah whispered, her voice tight with controlled fear. James had read extensively about bear encounters, but all of his theoretical knowledge seemed to evaporate in the face of this massive predator. The bear spray in his hand felt pitifully inadequate against such an enormous animal. The grizzly was still 50 yards away, but James knew that bears could cover that distance in a matter of seconds if they chose to charge. "We back away slowly," James said, his voice barely audible. "Stay together. Make ourselves look big, but don't make direct eye contact." The family began to move as a unit, backing slowly away from the water's edge and toward the trail that would lead them back to camp. Their movements were coordinated and deliberate, with James leading and Sarah bringing up the rear while carrying Sophie. For a moment, it seemed like the strategy might work. The grizzly remained in place, watching but not advancing. The distance between them remained constant as the family slowly retreated. But then Marcus stumbled. The 12-year-old boy stepped backward onto a loose rock that rolled under his foot, sending him tumbling to the ground with a crash that echoed across the water. The sudden noise and movement triggered an immediate response from the grizzly. The bear's ears pinned back against his skull, and he let out a huffing sound that carried clearly across the distance between them. This was a warning vocalization, a sign that the bear was becoming increasingly agitated and might be preparing to charge. "Get up, Marcus," James urged, helping his son to his feet while keeping his eyes on the bear. "Everybody keep moving." But the damage was done. The family's coordinated retreat had been disrupted, and the bear interpreted the sudden movement and noise as aggressive behavior. In the wild, such actions often preceded an attack, and the grizzly's instincts were telling him to respond accordingly. The bear began to move forward, not yet charging but closing the distance with long, purposeful strides. Each step brought 700 pounds of muscle and bone closer to the terrified family. "Run," James said, abandoning the slow retreat strategy. "Everyone run for the trees." The family broke into a sprint, abandoning their tarp and snacks on the beach as they raced for the safety of the forest. Behind them, the grizzly's movement shifted from a purposeful walk to a ground-covering lope that demonstrated the animal's surprising speed and agility. Grizzly bears can run up to 35 miles per hour, faster than any human, and they can maintain that speed over considerable distances. As the family reached the tree line, the bear was gaining on them rapidly, his massive paws throwing up clouds of sand and pebbles as he crossed the beach. The forest trail that had seemed so peaceful during their descent now became a desperate obstacle course as the family ran for their lives. Fallen logs that they had stepped over carefully before now became barriers to vault or scramble around. Low-hanging branches caught at their clothing and hair, and roots threatened to trip them with every step. Sophie, being carried by Sarah, was crying in terror and confusion. Emma ran with the desperate speed that only pure panic can provide, while Marcus struggled to keep up despite his longer legs. James brought up the rear, turning occasionally to check the bear's position and clutching the bear spray that he prayed he wouldn't have to use. The grizzly followed them into the forest, his massive bulk crashing through the underbrush with surprising ease. Trees that would stop a human seemed to bend out of his way, and the small logs and rocks that slowed the family's progress were simply trampled underfoot. As they ran, James tried to remember everything he had read about grizzly bear behavior. The fact that the bear was chasing them was actually a bad sign. Most bears would have been satisfied with driving intruders out of their territory. This continued pursuit suggested that the animal might be defending something specific, like a food cache or cubs, or that he was in an unusually aggressive state. The trail curved and twisted through the forest, following the natural contours of the land as it climbed away from the lake. The family's desperate flight was taking them roughly in the direction of their campsite, but James realized, with growing horror, that they were leading the bear directly toward their base camp and all their gear. "The campsite!" Sarah gasped as they ran. "We can't lead him to the campsite." She was right. If the bear associated their scent with the location of their camp, he might return later to investigate their food stores or simply to mark the area as his territory. Either scenario could result in the destruction of their gear and supplies, stranding them in the wilderness. But they had little choice. The bear was gaining on them, and the campsite was the only place where they had any resources that might help them in this situation. Their vehicle was parked there, along with additional bear spray and other emergency supplies. As they climbed the trail, the family's pace began to slow from pure exhaustion. Sophie was getting heavy in Sarah's arms, and the altitude was making everyone breathe hard. Marcus was beginning to lag behind, his shorter legs struggling to maintain the pace set by the adults. "I can't run anymore," Marcus gasped, stumbling to a halt and bending over with his hands on his knees. James turned to assess the situation and felt his blood run cold. The grizzly was less than 30 yards behind them and closing fast. The bear's mouth was open, revealing massive canine teeth, and foam was beginning to appear around his lips, a sign of extreme agitation that suggested the animal was moving beyond warning behavior into actual aggressive action. "Climb!" James shouted, pointing to a large Douglas fir tree beside the trail. "Everyone climb now!" The family converged on the tree, with James boosting Marcus up to the lowest branch, while Sarah lifted Sophie as high as she could reach. Emma, being the lightest and most agile, scrambled up the trunk with the desperate efficiency of someone whose life depended on getting off the ground. Grizzly bears, despite their massive size, are capable climbers, particularly when they are young. Adult bears can climb trees if the branches are strong enough to support their weight and spaced appropriately for their large paws. However, most adult grizzlies are reluctant to climb unless highly motivated, as their bulk makes it awkward and energy-intensive. As the family pulled themselves up into the relative safety of the tree, the grizzly reached the base of the trunk. Standing on his hind legs, the bear was nearly 8 feet tall, bringing his massive head and front paws disturbingly close to Marcus, who was clinging to the lowest branch just 10 feet off the ground. The bear began to circle the tree, huffing and occasionally making woofing sounds that expressed his frustration and continued agitation. He reared up against the trunk several times, leaving deep claw marks in the bark and shaking the entire tree with his weight. "Is he going to climb up here?" Sophie whispered, her voice small and terrified. "I don't think so," James replied, though he wasn't entirely certain. "He's too big. The branches wouldn't hold him." From their perch in the tree, the family could fully appreciate the bear's enormous size. His massive head was nearly 3 feet wide, and his front paws were larger than dinner plates. The muscles under his brown fur rippled with every movement, and his small dark eyes held an intelligence that was both fascinating and terrifying. The grizzly continued to circle the tree for several more minutes, occasionally standing on his hind legs to test the strength of the lower branches. Each time he did this, the entire tree would sway, causing the family to grip their branches more tightly and sending waves of terror through the children. But gradually, the bear's agitation began to subside. He had successfully driven the intruders away from the lake and up into the trees, which satisfied his immediate territorial instincts. Without the visual stimulus of running humans triggering his chase response, his behavior began to return to normal. The grizzly gave the tree one final sniff, marking the bark with his scent glands, then turned and began to walk back toward the lake. His departure was as sudden as his appearance had been threatening. One moment he was circling the tree like a massive predator, and the next he was simply walking away through the forest as if the family had never existed. "Is he gone?" Emma whispered after several minutes of silence. James waited another 5 minutes before carefully climbing down from the tree to check the area. The forest around them seemed peaceful again, with no sign of the massive bear that had terrorized them just minutes before, but the deep claw marks on the tree trunk and the churned earth around its base provided clear evidence that the encounter had been terrifyingly real. "I think so," James said, helping the rest of his family down from their refuge. "But we need to get back to camp and figure out what to do next." The remaining climb to their campsite was accomplished in tense silence, with everyone constantly checking the forest around them for any sign of the bear's return. When they finally emerged into the small clearing where they had set up camp, the familiar sight of their tent and camping gear provided a small measure of comfort. But James knew that their situation had fundamentally changed. They were now sharing this wilderness area with a large, aggressive grizzly bear that had already demonstrated his willingness to chase humans and had most likely caught their scent. The bear knew where they were, and there was no guarantee that he wouldn't return to investigate their camp. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked, voicing the question that was on everyone's mind. James considered their options as he checked their gear and supplies. They could pack up immediately and leave, which would be the safest course of action, but would mean abandoning their planned 3-day camping trip. They could stay and hope that the bear would move on to other areas, but that carried obvious risks. Or they could modify their behavior to minimize the chances of another encounter while still salvaging some portion of their camping experience. "We're going to stay," James decided, after careful consideration. "But we're going to make some changes to how we do things. We'll keep all our food locked in the truck instead of hanging it. We'll make more noise when we move around. And we're not going back down to the lake." Sarah looked uncertain about this decision, but she trusted her husband's judgment in outdoor matters. The children seemed relieved that they wouldn't have to pack up and leave immediately, though the joy had definitely gone out of their camping adventure. As the afternoon wore on, the family tried to return to normal camping activities, but the bear encounter had changed everything. Every sound from the forest now made them freeze and listen. Every shadow that moved in their peripheral vision caused hearts to race. The peaceful wilderness experience that James had planned for his family had been replaced by a constant state of low-level fear and hypervigilance. They prepared dinner on their camp stove, but instead of the relaxed family meal they had planned, everyone ate quickly and nervously, constantly scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. As soon as they finished eating, all the food and cooking equipment was secured in the back of the 4Runner, along with their toothpaste, soap, and anything else that might attract a bear's attention. "Tell us about grizzly bears, Dad," Marcus requested as they sat around their campfire that evening. "How big do they get? How fast can they run?" James found himself in the difficult position of providing educational information about the animal that had terrorized his family without making the children more frightened than they already were. He explained that grizzly bears were actually a subspecies of brown bear, that adult males could weigh up to 800 pounds, and that they were incredibly intelligent and adaptable animals. "The important thing to remember," James said, "is that bears usually want to avoid humans just as much as we want to avoid them. What happened today was unusual. We surprised him, and he was probably protecting something he considered important." Emma had been unusually quiet since their return to camp, and James noticed that she kept checking her phone despite the lack of cell service. Finally, she looked up from her device with a troubled expression. "Dad, I got a few pictures of the bear when we first saw him," she said hesitantly. "I was taking a selfie and accidentally got him in the background. Do you want to see?" James took his daughter's phone and studied the image on the screen. The photograph was somewhat blurry due to Emma's movement and the distance involved, but it clearly showed the massive grizzly standing at the edge of the forest. Even in the poor quality image, the bear's enormous size was obvious. "This is actually really valuable," James said, his mind already working through the implications. "We should report this encounter to the Park Service or wildlife officials. They need to know there's a large grizzly in this area." But as James examined the photograph more closely, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. In the background of the image, barely visible through the trees, he could make out what appeared to be a large, dark mound. It was difficult to see clearly, but the shape and size suggested it might be a carcass of some kind, possibly an elk or deer that the bear had killed and was defending. If the grizzly was indeed defending a kill site, that would explain his aggressive behavior and unwillingness to simply flee when confronted by humans. Bears defending food sources are among the most dangerous animals in North America, and they will attack anything they perceive as a threat to their meal. James decided not to share this observation with his family, at least not immediately. They were already frightened enough, and speculation about the bear's motivations wouldn't help their current situation. But privately, he began to reconsider his decision to stay at the campsite. As darkness fell over the forest, the family retreated to their tent for the night. James had moved their vehicle closer to the tent opening, positioning it so they could reach the relative safety of the forerunner quickly if necessary. He also kept a flashlight and the bear spray within easy reach of his sleeping bag. Sleep came fitfully to the Collins family that night. Every sound from the forest, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of wind through the pine needles, the distant call of a coyote, caused someone to wake up and listen intently. James found himself checking his watch repeatedly, counting the hours until dawn would provide enough light to pack up and leave if they decided to cut their trip short. At approximately 2:30 in the morning, James was awakened by a sound that made his heart race. Something large was moving through the forest near their campsite, breaking branches and stepping on fallen leaves with enough force to create clearly audible footfalls. He lay perfectly still in his sleeping bag, straining to identify the source of the sound while fighting the urge to wake his family. The footsteps seemed to be circling their campsite at a distance of perhaps 50 yards, moving slowly and deliberately through the trees. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 minutes, the sounds faded away into the distance. James remained awake for the rest of the night, listening for any indication that the visitor might return. When dawn finally broke over the forest, James quietly unzipped the tent and stepped outside to check for any signs of nocturnal visitors. What he found made his decision about staying or leaving immediately clear. Large tracks circled their campsite, clearly visible in the soft earth around their tent. The tracks were unmistakably those of a grizzly bear, each print nearly a foot long with distinctive claw marks extending several inches beyond the toe pads. The bear had indeed returned during the night, investigating their camp and probably testing for any scents that might indicate accessible food. Most disturbing was a set of tracks that approached within 10 feet of their tent before veering away toward the forerunner. The bear had examined their vehicle, leaving muddy paw prints on the rear bumper and passenger side window. Fortunately, James had secured all their food and scented items inside the truck, so the bear had found nothing to reward his curiosity. But the message was clear. The grizzly now associated this location with the human family, and he was comfortable enough in their presence to investigate their camp at night. This was exactly the kind of situation that wildlife officials warned against. A bear that was losing his natural fear of humans and beginning to see them as a potential food source rather than a threat to be avoided. "Sarah," James called quietly, unzipping the tent entrance, "we need to pack up and leave, now." Sarah emerged from the tent, took one look at the tracks around their campsite, and immediately began organizing their gear for a hasty departure. The children were roused from sleep and quickly dressed, though they were still too drowsy to fully comprehend the urgency of the situation. "Why are we leaving so early?" Sophie asked, rubbing her eyes as she stumbled out of the tent. "The bear came back last night," James explained, as he began taking down the tent with practiced efficiency. "He's getting too comfortable around our camp. It's not safe to stay here anymore." The family worked together to break camp in record time, loading their gear into the 4Runner with the quick efficiency born of necessity rather than leisure. Every few minutes, someone would pause to scan the forest around them, but the woods remained peaceful in the early morning light. As they worked, James kept thinking about the bear tracks circling their campsite. The animal had spent considerable time investigating their camp, which suggested a level of interest that went beyond simple curiosity. Combined with the possible carcass he had spotted in Emma's photograph, the situation was becoming increasingly dangerous. Within 45 minutes, they had completely broken camp and loaded all their gear into the vehicle. As James started the engine and began backing out of the clearing, he felt a profound sense of relief mixed with disappointment. The camping trip he had planned for months was ending in failure, and his children's introduction to wilderness camping had been traumatic rather than inspiring. But as they drove back down the narrow dirt track toward the main Forest Service road, James knew he had made the right decision. The safety of his family was more important than any camping experience, and the behavior exhibited by the grizzly bear was clearly escalating toward a potentially dangerous confrontation. They were halfway down the mountain when Emma, who had been looking back through the rear window, suddenly grabbed her father's arm. "Dad, stop the truck," she said urgently. James immediately pulled over and turned to follow his daughter's gaze. Behind them, perhaps 200 yards up the trail, a massive brown form had emerged from the forest and was standing in the middle of the dirt road. The grizzly bear was following them. Even at that distance, the animal's enormous size was clearly apparent. He stood motionless in the center of the track, his massive head turned in their direction, as if he was watching their departure with interest rather than relief. "Why is he following us?" Marcus whispered, his voice tight with fear. James had no good answer to that question. In all his reading about bear behavior, he had never encountered accounts of grizzlies following vehicles or pursuing humans beyond their immediate territory. The bear's behavior was becoming increasingly abnormal and unpredictable. "I don't know," James admitted, putting the truck back in gear and continuing their descent. "But we're getting out of here." As they drove down the mountain, James found himself constantly checking the rear-view mirror for any sign of continued pursuit. The bear remained visible for several minutes, standing in the middle of the road and apparently watching their retreat, before finally disappearing back into the forest. The family drove in relative silence for the next hour, each lost in their own thoughts about the encounter and its implications. It wasn't until they reached the main highway and began to see other vehicles and signs of civilization that everyone began to relax slightly. "Should we report this to someone?" Sarah asked as they drove through the small town of Big Fork on the shore of Flathead Lake. "Absolutely," James replied. "There's a ranger station in Kalispell. We need to let them know about this bear's behavior." The Flathead National Forest Ranger Station was located in a modern building on the outskirts of Kalispell, staffed by Forest Service personnel who were responsible for managing wildlife encounters and public safety in the vast wilderness areas surrounding Flathead Lake. James pulled into the parking lot and gathered his family for what he hoped would be a routine report of a wildlife encounter. Rangers Jennifer Martinez and Robert Thompson were on duty when the Collins family walked through the front door of the station. Both rangers were experienced wildlife management professionals who had dealt with hundreds of bear encounters over their careers. But they immediately recognized that something about this family's demeanor suggested their experience had been more serious than typical tourist wildlife sightings. "We had an encounter with a grizzly bear yesterday," James began, settling into a chair across from Ranger Martinez's desk. "We were camping in the dispersed camping area off Forest Service Road 618, and the bear seemed unusually aggressive. He chased us up a tree and then came back to investigate our campsite during the night." Ranger Martinez pulled out a standard wildlife encounter report form and began asking detailed questions about the location, time, and circumstances of the encounter. As James described the events, both rangers exchanged concerned glances. The behavior he was describing was indeed unusual for a grizzly bear in that area. "Did you get any photographs or video of the bear?" Ranger Thompson asked. Emma produced her phone and showed the rangers the blurry image she had captured during their first sighting. Both rangers studied the photograph carefully, paying particular attention to the bear's size and the background details. "That's definitely a grizzly," Ranger Martinez confirmed, "and he's a big one. Look at the shoulder hump and the facial profile. This is probably a mature male, maybe 6 or 7 years old." As the rangers continued to examine the photograph, Thompson noticed the same dark shape in the background that had caught James's attention the night before. "Can you enhance this image at all?" Thompson asked, pointing to the indistinct form visible through the trees. "There's something back there that I'd like to get a better look at." Emma manipulated her phone's photo editing software to zoom in on the background of the image. As the picture enlarged, the dark shape became clearer, revealing what was unmistakably the remains of a large animal partially concealed in the forest undergrowth. "That's an elk carcass," Ranger Martinez said grimly. "The bear was defending a kill site. That explains the aggressive behavior." The discovery of the carcass changed the entire nature of the encounter report. Bears defending food sources represent one of the most dangerous situations that can occur in wilderness areas. And the fact that this particular bear had been willing to pursue humans away from his kill site suggested an animal with an unusually high level of aggression. "We need to close that area immediately," Thompson said, reaching for his radio to contact other Forest Service personnel. "If there's a bear actively defending a carcass in a popular camping area, we need to get warning signs posted and keep people out until the situation resolves." Over the next hour, the rangers gathered detailed information about the encounter and began coordinating a response that would involve multiple agencies. The Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife and Parks would need to be notified, as they were responsible for managing large predator encounters. The local sheriff's department would also be contacted, as they often assisted with search and rescue operations in cases where bear encounters resulted in injuries. Most importantly, the rangers began the process of temporarily closing the dispersed camping area where the Collins family had encountered the bear. Within hours, warning signs would be posted at all access points, and Forest Service personnel would begin monitoring the area for continued bear activity. "You did exactly the right thing by leaving when you did," Ranger Martinez told the family as they prepared to leave the station. "Bears defending kill sites are extremely dangerous, and the fact that this one was comfortable enough to investigate your camp at night suggests he was losing his natural fear of humans." As the Collins family left the ranger station, James felt a mixture of relief and vindication. Their encounter had been taken seriously by wildlife professionals, and steps were being taken to prevent other families from experiencing similar situations. But he also felt a lingering sense of unease about the bear's behavior, particularly his apparent willingness to follow their vehicle as they left the area. The family spent that night in a motel in Kalispell, a stark contrast to the wilderness camping experience they had planned. The children seemed to be recovering from their fright, treating the encounter as an exciting adventure now that they were safely back in civilization. But James and Sarah found themselves repeatedly discussing the events and wondering if they had made any mistakes that might have contributed to the dangerous situation. "Do you think we'll ever go camping again?" Sarah asked as they lay in bed that night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of traffic and air conditioning instead of wind through pine trees. "Yes," James replied after a moment of consideration. "But we'll be a lot more careful about researching bear activity in any area before we set up camp." and maybe we'll stick to established campgrounds with regular ranger patrols for a while." The next morning brought news that validated James's decision to report their encounter to the authorities. Ranger Thompson called their motel room to inform them that Forest Service personnel had visited the camping area and confirmed the presence of an elk carcass approximately 300 yards from where the Collins family had set up their tent. More significantly, trail cameras set up in the area had captured images of the grizzly bear returning to the carcass multiple times over the past week. The bear was indeed a large, mature male, estimated to weigh between 600 and 700 pounds, and his behavior around the kill site was consistent with an animal that had become territorial and aggressive about defending his food source. "The good news is that we expect him to move on once he's finished feeding," Thompson explained. "Bears typically abandon carcass sites after a week or two, especially once the meat begins to decompose beyond palatability. We'll keep the area closed for at least another 2 weeks, and then we'll reassess based on continued monitoring." But Thompson also shared information that was more troubling. Analysis of the trail camera images had revealed that the bear had made multiple visits to the exact clearing where the Collins family had camped, both before and after their encounter. The timestamps on the images showed that the bear had been in their campsite area just 6 hours before their arrival, and he had returned within 2 hours of their departure. "It's almost like he was waiting for you to come back," Thompson said, though he quickly added that such behavior would be highly unusual for a wild grizzly bear. The implications of this information were disturbing. If the bear had indeed been monitoring their campsite with such frequency, it suggested a level of intelligence and planning that went beyond typical bear behavior. It also raised questions about what might have happened if the family had decided to stay for their planned 3-day camping trip. When James shared this information with his family over breakfast, the mood around the table became noticeably more somber. The realization that they had been in much greater danger than they had initially understood made their escape seem even more fortunate. "Are we famous now?" Marcus asked, trying to lighten the mood. "Are they going to put our story on the news?" As it turned out, Marcus's question was more prescient than he realized. That afternoon, a reporter from the local newspaper called their motel room, asking for an interview about their bear encounter. Word of the camping area closure and the circumstances that had prompted it was beginning to spread through the local community. James was initially reluctant to speak with the media, but Ranger Martinez had encouraged him to share their story as a way of educating other campers about bear safety and the importance of reporting wildlife encounters. After discussing it with Sarah, he agreed to a brief interview. The newspaper article appeared 3 days later under the headline, "Family's Close Call Leads to Camping Area Closure." The story accurately described the Collins family's encounter and included expert commentary from wildlife biologists about grizzly bear behavior and safety precautions for wilderness camping. But the article also attracted unwanted attention from adventure tourism enthusiasts and thrill seekers who seemed more interested in the dramatic aspects of the encounter than the safety lessons it provided. James began receiving phone calls and emails from people wanting more details about the location and circumstances of their bear encounter. Some of these inquiries came from legitimate sources: researchers studying bear behavior, documentary filmmakers working on wildlife programs, and outdoor education organizations developing safety curricula. But others came from individuals who seemed to view the dangerous encounter as an exciting challenge rather than a serious safety threat. One particularly disturbing call came from a self-described extreme camping enthusiast who wanted to know the exact coordinates of their campsite so he could attempt to recreate their encounter with the grizzly bear. James firmly declined to provide this information and reported the call to the Forest Service rangers. "Some people have no idea how dangerous these situations really are," Ranger Thompson commented when James told him about the phone call. They see the dramatic stories but don't understand that we're talking about encounters with 700-pound predators that can kill a human being in seconds. The media attention also brought contact from other families who had experienced similar encounters in the same general area. Over the following weeks, James received several calls from people who had encountered large grizzly bears while camping or hiking in the Flathead Lake region during the past month. These reports painted a picture of increased grizzly bear activity throughout the area, possibly driven by drought conditions that had reduced natural food sources at higher elevations. Several other camping areas had been temporarily closed due to aggressive bear behavior, and there had been multiple incidents of bears breaking into vehicles and campers in search of food. "It sounds like we weren't the only ones having problems with bears this summer," Sarah observed as James finished a phone conversation with another camper who had encountered the same bear, or one very similar to it, just 2 weeks after their own experience. The other family's encounter had been even more frightening than the Collins family's experience. The bear had actually entered their campsite while they were eating dinner, forcing them to retreat to their vehicle while the animal destroyed their tent and scattered their gear throughout the forest. Only the arrival of other campers with air horns and bear spray had finally driven the bear away. "This bear is definitely getting bolder around humans," James said, feeling grateful once again that his family had escaped their encounter without injury. "I think we made the right decision to leave when we did." As the weeks passed, and the Collins family settled back into their normal routine in Missoula, the bear encounter began to fade from immediate memory, while still influencing their attitudes toward outdoor recreation. James found himself researching bear activity reports obsessively before planning any hiking or camping trips, and Sarah insisted on carrying multiple canisters of bear spray whenever they ventured into wilderness areas. The children's reactions varied. Emma had become fascinated by wildlife photography and bear behavior, spending hours online researching grizzly bears and their ecological role in Montana's ecosystems. Marcus seemed to have bounced back completely from the frightening experience and was already asking when they could go camping again. Sophie, being the youngest, had the most lingering fears about outdoor activities, often asking if there might be bears in areas where they were highly unlikely to be encountered. 2 months after their encounter, James received a call from Ranger Thompson with an update on the situation in their former camping area. The elk carcass had been completely consumed, and trail camera monitoring had detected no bear activity in the immediate area for over 3 weeks. "We're planning to reopen the camping area next week," Thompson explained. "Our wildlife biologists believe the bear has moved on to other areas, probably heading toward higher elevation sites where he'll begin looking for a denning location for winter hibernation." But Thompson also shared some disturbing news. The same bear, identified by distinctive markings visible in trail camera images, had been involved in 2 more encounters with humans in other areas of the national forest. In both cases, the bear had approached campsites and showed little fear of human presence, behavior that was becoming increasingly problematic. "We're considering options for relocating this particular bear," Thompson said. "His behavior is escalating to the point where he represents a genuine threat to public safety. Unfortunately, relocation isn't always successful with grizzlies, especially large adult males who have established territories." James understood the implications of Thompson's carefully worded statement. If relocation efforts failed, or if the bear's aggressive behavior continued to escalate, wildlife officials might be forced to destroy the animal. It was a sobering reminder that human-wildlife conflicts rarely had happy endings for the wildlife involved. The thought that their encounter might ultimately result in the death of the magnificent animal they had observed filled James with complex emotions. On one hand, he understood that public safety had to be the priority when dealing with large predators that lost their fear of humans. On the other hand, He felt a profound sadness at the possibility that such a remarkable creature might pay with his life for behavior that was largely driven by natural instincts and environmental pressures. "What happens to bears that get relocated?" Emma asked when James shared the update with his family. "Sometimes they adapt to their new territory and live normal lives," James explained, "but large male grizzlies often try to return to their original territory, which can result in conflicts with other bears or additional encounters with humans. Relocation is really a last resort when a bear's behavior becomes too dangerous to tolerate." The conversation led to a broader family discussion about the challenges of managing wildlife in areas where human recreation and natural habitats overlap. James used the opportunity to help his children understand that their bear encounter was part of a larger conservation challenge facing national parks and wilderness areas throughout North America. Over the following months, the Collins family gradually returned to outdoor recreation activities, but with a much deeper understanding of the risks involved and the precautions necessary for safe wilderness camping. They invested in high-quality bear canisters for food storage, upgraded their bear spray to military-grade formulations, and always camped in established campgrounds with regular ranger patrols. Their experience also led James to become involved with local outdoor education organizations, sharing their story as part of bear safety presentations for scout groups and camping clubs. He found that telling their story in an educational context helped him process the emotional impact of the encounter while potentially preventing similar dangerous situations for other families. "The most important thing people need to understand," James would tell these groups, "is that bears are incredibly intelligent and powerful animals that deserve our respect and caution. We were fortunate that our encounter ended without injury, but it could easily have gone very differently if we had made different decisions or if the bear had been even more aggressive." 1 year after their encounter, James received a final update from the Forest Service about the fate of the grizzly bear that had terrorized his family. The bear had been successfully captured and relocated to a remote area of Glacier National Park, approximately 200 miles from his original territory. Trail cameras and GPS collar data had confirmed that the bear was adapting well to his new environment and had not shown any aggressive behavior toward humans since his relocation. He had successfully denned for the winter and emerged in good condition the following spring, suggesting that the relocation effort had been successful. "It's the best possible outcome," Ranger Thompson explained during his final call to the Collins family. "This bear will hopefully live out the rest of his natural life in an area where he's less likely to encounter humans, and families like yours can continue to enjoy wilderness camping without worrying about this particular animal." The news brought a sense of closure to an experience that had profoundly impacted the Collins family's relationship with Montana's wilderness. They had learned important lessons about wildlife safety and the unpredictable nature of encounters with large predators, lessons that would influence their outdoor activities for years to come. But perhaps more importantly, they had gained a deeper appreciation for the complex challenges facing wildlife managers who must balance public safety with conservation goals. Their encounter had provided valuable data about grizzly bear behavior that would inform future management decisions and potentially prevent similar incidents, dangerous situations for other wilderness enthusiasts. As James reflected on the experience during a family camping trip the following summer, this time in a well-developed campground with regular ranger patrols, he realized that their bear encounter had ultimately enriched their understanding of the natural world rather than diminishing their love for wilderness recreation. The fear and terror of that September morning by Flathead Lake had given way to respect and caution, emotions that were perhaps more appropriate for humans venturing into the domain of one of North America's most powerful predators. They would continue to camp and hike in Montana's magnificent wilderness areas, but they would do so with the wisdom earned through their close encounter with the grizzly bear that had forever changed their family's relationship with the wild places they loved. The story of their encounter would be retold many times over the years, serving as both a cautionary tale about wilderness safety and a reminder of the incredible wildlife that still roams the mountains and forests of the American West. For the Collins family, it had become a defining moment that demonstrated both the potential dangers and the profound beauty of sharing the landscape with creatures that had ruled these mountains long before the first humans ever ventured into their domain. In the end, both the bear and the family had survived their encounter, each returning to their respective worlds with a greater understanding of the other. It was perhaps the best possible outcome for a confrontation between human visitors and one of the wilderness's most formidable residents, a reminder that coexistence was possible with proper respect, preparation, and a healthy dose of caution when venturing into the wild places where grizzly bears still roam free. The next story is The Last Ridge Doctor. Sarah Chen had been leading wilderness expeditions for 15 years, but something about this morning felt different. The air hung too still in the pre-dawn darkness of the Cascade Mountains, and the usual chorus of birds seemed muted. She checked her watch, 4:47 a.m., and quietly unzipped her tent to peer across their campsite at Copper Lake. The research team of 6 had been studying wolf pack migration patterns for 3 weeks now, deep in the remote wilderness of the North Cascades. What had started as a routine wildlife research expedition was about to become something none of them had trained for. Marcus Rivera, the team's lead biologist, was already awake, sitting by the remnants of last night's fire with a steaming cup of coffee. At 42, he'd spent more nights in the wilderness than most people spent in hotels, but even he looked uneasy this morning. "Sleep okay?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice low to avoid waking the others. Marcus shook his head. "The wolves were active all night, different packs, moving in patterns I've never seen before. It's like they're being pushed out of their territory by something." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She'd noticed the same thing in the past 2 days: unusual animal behavior, tracks they couldn't identify, and an eerie absence of the smaller wildlife that usually thrived in this area. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, their wildlife veterinarian, emerged from her tent looking pale and drawn. She'd been monitoring the health of a wolf pack they'd been tracking, but yesterday she'd found something that had kept her awake most of the night. "Sarah, we need to talk," Jennifer said, her voice tight with concern. "The blood samples I took from Wolfpack Delta, they're showing signs of a disease I don't recognize, something that's making them extremely aggressive and disoriented." The implications hit Sarah immediately. If there was a disease affecting the local wildlife, it could explain the bizarre behavior they'd been observing. More importantly, it meant their team was potentially in danger. The rest of the team began stirring as the sun crested the ridgeline. Tom Bradley, their wilderness guide and survival expert, was methodically checking their equipment and supplies. At 58, Tom had guided expeditions all over the world, and his weathered face rarely showed concern. This morning was an exception. "Storm's coming," he announced, pointing to the dark clouds gathering beyond the peaks. "Big one. We should consider heading back to base camp today instead of pushing deeper into the backcountry." Lisa Park, their graduate student researcher, looked disappointed. "But we're so close to finding the den site for Pack Alpha. We've been tracking them for weeks." "The weather won't wait for our research schedule," Tom replied firmly. "These mountains can turn deadly in minutes when a storm hits." The 6th member of their team, Dr. David Kumar, their conservation photographer, was already documenting the unusual cloud formations. David had an eye for capturing the raw beauty and danger of the wilderness, but lately his photos had been documenting something more unsettling: signs of ecological disruption that went beyond normal seasonal patterns. Sarah gathered the team around their portable camp table, spreading out topographical maps of the area. Given what Jennifer found and Tom's weather concerns, I think we need to make a decision about whether to continue or head back. The debate that followed would later seem trivial compared to what they were about to face. Marcus argued for pushing forward to complete their research, while Tom insisted the conditions were becoming too dangerous. Jennifer remained focused on the disease implications, wanting to collect more samples before leaving. It was Lisa who spotted the tracks. "These aren't from any wolf pack," she said, crouching near the edge of their campsite. "Look at the size of these prints and the gait pattern. Whatever made these is big, really big, and it's been circling our camp." Tom was beside her in seconds, his expression growing grim as he examined the tracks. "These are fresh, made sometime in the last few hours." He followed the trail with his eyes, noting how it circled their campsite multiple times before disappearing into the dense forest. "Whatever this is, it's been watching us." The mood of the camp shifted instantly. The academic discussions about research protocols and weather patterns suddenly seemed less important than the immediate question of their safety. Jennifer was taking photographs of the tracks when she noticed something else. "Look at this," she said, pointing to what appeared to be claw marks on a nearby tree. "These gouges are 8 feet off the ground and fresh." David was already documenting everything, his camera clicking rapidly as he captured the evidence. Through his lens, he could see details that made his stomach tighten. The depth of the claw marks, the height at which they'd been made, and most disturbing of all, tufts of dark fur caught in the bark. "We need to break camp. Now," Tom said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd survived countless dangerous situations. "Whatever made these tracks is still in the area, and it's showing territorial behavior." As the team hurriedly began packing their equipment, the weather began to deteriorate. The wind picked up, and the first drops of rain started falling. The storm Tom had predicted was arriving faster than expected. Sarah was coordinating the breakdown of their research equipment when Marcus called out from the far side of the camp. "Sarah, you need to see this immediately." She ran to where Marcus stood at the edge of a small clearing. What she saw made her blood run cold. The carcass of an adult elk lay in the center of the clearing, but it wasn't the presence of the dead animal that alarmed her. It was the way it had been killed. "This isn't a normal predation," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Look at the wounds. The elk was essentially torn apart, but very little of it was actually consumed. This was killing for the sake of killing." Jennifer joined them, and her veterinary training immediately picked up on details the others had missed. "The wounds are consistent with an extremely large predator, but the pattern is all wrong. Most predators kill efficiently and consume their prey. This looks like rage killing." Tom appeared beside them, took one look at the scene, and made an immediate decision. "We're leaving, right now. Pack only the essentials." As if summoned by his words, a low growling sound echoed through the forest around them. It was unlike anything any of them had heard before, deeper than a wolf's growl, more menacing than a bear's rumble. The sound seemed to come from multiple directions, as if they were surrounded. The team froze, listening intently. The growling stopped, replaced by a silence that was somehow even more terrifying. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. Even the wind seemed to have died away, leaving them in an eerie bubble of absolute quiet. "Move slowly back to camp," Tom whispered. "No sudden movements. Stay together." They began their careful retreat, but Lisa suddenly grabbed Sarah's arm. "There," she whispered, pointing to a gap between 2 large pine trees about 50 yards away. "Do you see it?" Sarah squinted into the shadows and felt her heart stop. A massive shape was moving through the trees, keeping pace with them, but staying just out of clear sight. It was huge, easily twice the size of the largest bear she'd ever seen, and it moved with an intelligence that was deeply unsettling. "It's stalking us," David whispered, his camera forgotten in his hands. "It's actually stalking us." They reached their camp and began grabbing essential supplies with trembling hands. The rain was falling harder now, and the wind was beginning to howl through the trees. The storm was providing cover for whatever was hunting them, making it impossible to hear approaching footsteps or determine exactly where their stalker was positioned. Tom was stuffing emergency supplies into his pack when he heard a sound that made him freeze, the distinctive snap of a large branch breaking under significant weight. The sound had come from directly behind their camp, much closer than before. "It's moved closer," he announced quietly. "We need to go. Now." As they shouldered their packs and prepared to leave, Jennifer made a discovery that changed everything. While gathering her research samples, she'd found tracks leading away from their camp toward the lake. But these weren't the same tracks they'd found earlier. "There's more than one," she said, her voice barely audible over the increasing wind. "The tracks are different sizes. We're not being stalked by one animal. We're being stalked by a group." The realization hit the team like a physical blow. Whatever these creatures were, they were hunting as a pack, demonstrating coordinated behavior that suggested intelligence far beyond normal animal instincts. Marcus was studying the different tracks when he noticed something that made the situation even more dire. "These tracks show they've been here for hours. They didn't just stumble across our camp. They've been planning this." The rain was now falling in torrents, and visibility was dropping rapidly. Tom knew that trying to navigate the mountain trails in these conditions would be extremely dangerous, but staying at their current location was clearly not an option. "There's an emergency shelter about 3 miles up the ridge," he told the group. "It's a hard climb, especially in this weather, but it's our best option. The shelter is built into the rock face, defensible position." As they prepared to leave, Sarah made a decision that would prove crucial. She activated their emergency beacon, sending a distress signal to the nearest ranger station. The device would transmit their GPS coordinates and alert rescue services that they were in trouble. "Signal sent," she announced, "but in this weather it could be hours or even days before anyone can reach us." The team formed a tight group with Tom leading and Sarah bringing up the rear. As they left their campsite and began climbing the muddy trail toward the ridge, none of them looked back. If they had, they might have seen the massive shapes emerging from the forest to investigate the camp they'd just abandoned. The climb was treacherous from the beginning. The rain had turned the trail into a slippery, muddy nightmare, and the wind was strong enough to throw them off balance. But the real terror came from the knowledge that they were being followed. Lisa was the first to hear them, the sound of heavy breathing and movement in the forest parallel to their trail. "They're keeping pace with us," she whispered to Sarah. "They're not trying to catch us, they're herding us." The realization was chilling. These weren't random animals attacking out of hunger or fear. They were demonstrating tactical thinking, working together to control the team's movement and options. About an hour into their climb, David spotted something that confirmed their worst fears. Through his camera's zoom lens, he could see multiple shapes moving through the trees below them. "I count at least 4, maybe 5, he reported. "They're definitely coordinating their movements." Tom pushed the pace, knowing that their only chance was to reach the emergency shelter before the creatures decided to attack. But the mountain was fighting them at every step. The rain had turned to sleet, making the rocks slippery and dangerous. The wind was howling so loudly that they could barely hear each other speak. Jennifer was struggling with the altitude and pace when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. "The trees," she gasped, pointing to their left. "Look at the trees." Deep claw marks scarred the bark of every large tree along their route, all at the same impossible height. Whatever was following them had been marking this territory for some time, claiming this entire section of the mountain as its domain. As they climbed higher, the weather continued to deteriorate. The sleet was turning to snow, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. Tom knew that hypothermia would soon become as much of a threat as whatever was stalking them. "How much further?" Marcus asked, his breath visible in the increasingly cold air. "About a mile," Tom replied, but his voice carried concern. In these conditions, a mile might as well be 10 miles. The trail was becoming increasingly treacherous, and the team was already showing signs of exhaustion. It was then that they heard the howl. It started low and built to a volume that seemed impossible for any earthly creature. The sound echoed off the mountains around them, seeming to come from everywhere at once. But this wasn't the howl of a wolf or the roar of a bear. It was something else entirely, something that spoke to a primal fear buried deep in human DNA. "What the hell was that?" David whispered, his hands shaking as he tried to keep his camera steady. Before anyone could answer, the howl was answered by multiple voices, creating a terrifying chorus that seemed to surround them completely. The creatures were communicating, coordinating their next move. Tom made a desperate decision. "We're leaving the trail. It's too exposed. We'll cut through the forest directly toward the shelter." Leaving the trail meant entering dense forest in a storm, with limited visibility and unknown terrain. It was incredibly dangerous under normal circumstances. With hostile creatures stalking them, it was potentially suicidal. But staying on the exposed trail was clearly no longer an option. As they plunged into the dark forest, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were making exactly the move their stalkers had wanted them to make. The creatures had herded them off the trail and into terrain where they held every advantage. The forest was a nightmare of low-hanging branches, hidden roots, and steep drops obscured by the storm. Lisa stumbled and nearly fell down a hidden ravine, saved only by Marcus grabbing her pack at the last second. "Stay close," Tom called back, though his voice was nearly lost in the wind. "Don't lose sight of the person in front of you." It was Jennifer who first realized they were no longer just being followed. They were being hunted. "They've split up," she whispered urgently. "I can hear movement on both sides of us. They're trying to surround us." The team instinctively moved closer together, forming a tight group as they continued their desperate push through the forest. Every shadow could hide a threat. Every sound could be their stalkers moving into position for an attack. David was documenting their movement when his camera flash accidentally fired, illuminating the forest around them for a split second. What he saw in that brief moment of light would haunt him for the rest of his life. Massive shapes moving through the trees on both sides, keeping pace with them, waiting for the right moment to strike. "They're huge," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I've never seen anything like them." Tom was navigating by compass and GPS, but the storm was interfering with the satellite signal, and the thick forest canopy made it difficult to get reliable readings. They were essentially moving blind through hostile territory, pursued by creatures that knew these mountains far better than they did. The first attack came without warning. Lisa was bringing up the rear when something massive crashed through the trees behind her. She screamed and threw herself forward, landing hard on the muddy ground as claws raked the air where she'd been standing. The team spun around to see a shape melting back into the forest. Too large to be a bear, too fast to be anything they recognized, but the message was clear. The creatures were done stalking. The hunt had begun. "Run!" Tom shouted, abandoning any attempt at stealth. The team crashed through the forest in blind panic, branches tearing at their clothes and faces. Behind them, they could hear the sounds of pursuit, heavy breathing, snapping branches, and a low rumbling that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. Marcus stumbled and fell, his pack scattering research equipment across the forest floor. Sarah helped him up, but as they ran, they could hear their pursuers investigating the scattered gear, making sounds that were disturbingly intelligent. "The shelter!" Tom called out, pointing ahead to where a rocky outcropping was barely visible through the trees. "I can see it!" And they burst from the forest onto a narrow ledge carved into the rock face. The emergency shelter was there, a small but solid structure built into the mountainside, designed to withstand the worst weather the mountains could throw at it. Tom fumbled with the heavy lock while the others kept watch on the forest behind them. The creatures hadn't emerged from the trees yet, but they could hear movement in the shadows, as if their stalkers were evaluating this new situation. "Got it!" Tom announced as the lock clicked open. The team piled into the shelter just as the first creature stepped out of the forest. In the brief moment before Tom slammed the heavy door shut, they all got their first clear look at what had been hunting them. It was massive, easily 9 feet tall when standing upright, with powerful limbs and features that seemed to combine the worst aspects of bear, wolf, and something altogether more primitive. Its eyes held an intelligence that was deeply unsettling. Tom threw the heavy bolt on the door just as something slammed against it from outside. The entire shelter shook with the impact, but the door held. "What the hell was that thing?" Lisa gasped, her voice shaking with terror and exhaustion. "I don't know," Jennifer replied. "But based on the disease symptoms I found in the wolves, I think we might be dealing with some kind of mutation or evolutionary response to environmental stress." Another impact shook the shelter, followed by the sound of claws scraping against metal. Their pursuers were testing the defenses, looking for weaknesses. The shelter was small but well-equipped, with emergency supplies, a radio, and most importantly, solid walls. Tom immediately went to the radio and began trying to raise the ranger station. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Dr. Sarah Chen's research team. We are under attack by unknown hostile wildlife at the emergency shelter on Ridge Trail 7. Request immediate assistance." Static was the only response. The storm was interfering with radio communications just as it was blocking their GPS signals. They were effectively cut off from the outside world. David was checking his camera when he made a disturbing discovery. The photos he'd taken during their escape showed details he hadn't noticed in the moment. The creatures weren't just large and aggressive. They showed signs of coordinated intelligence. In one image, he could clearly see one creature making what appeared to be hand signals to another. "This can't be right," he murmured, showing the images to Jennifer. "Animals don't communicate like this." Jennifer studied the photos with growing alarm. Combined with the disease symptoms she'd found in the local wildlife, a terrible possibility was beginning to form in her mind. "What if this isn't natural evolution?" she said slowly. "What if something environmental has triggered rapid genetic changes in the local predator population? Climate change, chemical contamination, or even some kind of unknown pathogen could theoretically cause accelerated mutations." The implications were staggering. If environmental factors were causing rapid evolutionary changes in the local wildlife, it would explain not just the size and aggression of their attackers, but also their apparent intelligence and coordinated behavior. Outside, the sounds of their stalkers had grown quieter, but somehow more ominous. Instead of direct attacks on the shelter, they could hear movement around the perimeter, as if the creatures were setting up a siege. Tom tried the radio again, adjusting frequencies and power settings, but the storm continued to block all communications. They were completely isolated, with unknown creatures surrounding their shelter and no way to call for help. "How long can we hold out here?" Marcus asked, taking inventory of their supplies. Tom checked the emergency stores. "Food and water for maybe 3 days, if we're careful. But that's assuming the storm breaks and we can get a radio signal out for rescue." Sarah was studying the shelter's construction when she noticed something that made her heart sink. "Look at these scratches around the doorframe. These aren't new. This shelter has been attacked before." The scratches were deep and extensive, suggesting that whatever had made them had spent considerable time trying to break in. More disturbing still, some of the scratches showed clear signs of tool use, as if the attackers had been using rocks or branches to try to pry open the door. Intelligence, David whispered, photographing the evidence. They're problem-solving, learning. As night fell, the true siege began. The creatures outside seemed to understand that their prey was trapped and had settled in for a long campaign. Throughout the night, the team was subjected to a psychological warfare campaign that seemed designed to break their morale. Sounds came from all directions, scratching at the walls, impacts against the door, and most disturbing of all, what sounded like attempts to communicate. The creatures were making sounds that weren't quite animal calls, but weren't quite human speech either. Lisa was the first to crack. "They're trying to talk to us," she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "Can you hear that?" "They're trying to say something." Jennifer moved to comfort her, but privately she was beginning to think Lisa might be right. The sounds from outside were following patterns that suggested linguistic structure, repetition, rhythm, and what might have been attempts at mimicry. If environmental stress has triggered rapid evolution, Jennifer explained quietly to Sarah, increased brain size and cognitive ability would be among the most advantageous adaptations. We might be dealing with creatures that are literally getting smarter as we watch. The night dragged on, with no let-up in the psychological assault. The creatures outside seemed to have unlimited patience, taking turns keeping up the pressure while others presumably rested. It was a level of strategic thinking that was deeply disturbing. Tom had managed to get brief radio contact twice during the night, but both times the signal had been too weak and distorted to communicate their situation effectively. The ranger station knew they were in distress, but not the nature of their emergency. As dawn approached, the sounds from outside changed. Instead of the constant harassment they'd endured all night, they heard what sounded like the creatures moving away from the shelter. But rather than feeling relieved, the team found this development even more ominous. "They're regrouping," Tom said grimly, "planning something new." When full daylight arrived, Tom carefully opened a small observation window to assess their situation. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. The creatures hadn't left. They'd simply pulled back to positions where they could observe the shelter while remaining mostly hidden. "They're waiting," he reported. "But for what?" The answer came an hour later, when they heard the sound of helicopters in the distance. The ranger station had received enough of their distress calls to launch a search and rescue operation. But as the helicopter sounds grew closer, the creatures around their shelter began moving with obvious purpose. "They know what those sounds mean," Sarah realized with growing horror. "They understand that help is coming, and they're preparing to intercept it." Through the observation window, they could see several of the massive creatures positioning themselves in the landing zones where a rescue helicopter would likely try to set down. Others were moving toward high points where they could attack from above. Tom grabbed the radio and began trying desperately to reach the incoming rescue team. "Aircraft approaching Ridge Trail 7. This is the trapped research team. Do not attempt landing. Repeat, do not attempt landing. Area is controlled by hostile unknown wildlife. Extremely dangerous." The radio crackled with static, but then a voice came through clearly. "Research team, this is Rescue 1. We copy your transmission. Can you clarify the nature of the wildlife threat?" "Large, intelligent predators. Coordinated pack behavior. They've anticipated your arrival and are positioned to attack any landing attempt." There was a long pause before the rescue pilot responded. "Research team, we're going to need to reassess our approach. Stand by for further instructions." The helicopter sounds faded as the aircraft withdrew to a safe distance. The creatures around the shelter seemed to understand that their strategy had worked. They'd successfully prevented the rescue attempt. Jennifer was monitoring their radio communications when she made a chilling observation. "They're learning from everything we do. When we called for help, they figured out what it meant. When the helicopter came, they knew how to counter it. They're adapting to us faster than we can adapt to them." The realization that they were facing creatures capable of rapid learning and strategic thinking changed everything. This wasn't just a survival situation. It was an intellectual battle against opponents who were getting smarter by the hour. Tom was studying maps and trying to formulate an escape plan when Sarah made a discovery that offered a glimmer of hope. The emergency shelter had been built with a rear exit, a narrow tunnel that led to an observation post about 100 yards away. The tunnel was small and would be difficult to navigate, but it might offer a way out that their stalkers hadn't anticipated. "It's risky," Tom admitted after examining the tunnel entrance. "If they're watching the other end, we'd be trapped in a space too narrow to defend. But if we can make it to the observation post undetected, there's a trail from there that leads down the backside of the mountain." The debate over whether to attempt the escape was interrupted by a new development outside. The creatures had begun what could only be described as construction activity. They were moving rocks and fallen trees, building what appeared to be barriers around the shelter. "They're not just laying siege," Marcus observed in amazement. "They're actually building fortifications. This level of tool use and construction behavior is unprecedented in any known species." David was documenting everything through the observation window when he noticed something that made him gasp. One of the creatures was manipulating what appeared to be a primitive tool, a rock that had been deliberately shaped for a specific purpose. "Tool making," he whispered. "They're not just using tools, they're making them." The implications were staggering. If these creatures were capable of tool creation and construction, they represented a level of intelligence that approached or possibly exceeded early human cognitive development. Jennifer was running calculations based on everything they'd observed. If environmental stress has accelerated their evolution to this degree, we might be seeing changes that would normally take thousands of years, happening in just a few generations. This could be the emergence of a new species, one that's specifically adapted to dominate this environment. As the creatures continued their construction work outside, the team faced a terrible realization. They weren't just trapped by animals. They were prisoners of a new intelligence that was actively working to keep them contained. The decision to attempt the tunnel escape was made when Tom observed that the creature's construction activity was concentrated on the front and sides of the shelter. The rear area, where the tunnel exit was located, seemed to be less heavily monitored. "If we're going to try this, it has to be now," he told the group. While they're focused on their building project, one by one they entered the narrow tunnel. Tom went first, followed by Lisa, then Jennifer, Marcus, David, and finally Sarah. The tunnel was barely wide enough for an adult to crawl through, and in some places they had to squeeze through gaps that seemed impossibly tight. The journey through the tunnel was a claustrophobic nightmare. The walls seemed to press in from all sides, and more than once someone got stuck and had to be pulled through by the person ahead. But worse than the physical discomfort was the constant fear that they would emerge from the tunnel to find their captors waiting for them. Tom reached the observation post first and carefully surveyed the area before signaling the others to join him. Miraculously, the creatures seemed to have overlooked this escape route. The observation post was empty, and the trail down the backside of the mountain appeared clear. "Move fast and stay quiet," Tom whispered as the team regrouped. "If they figure out we've escaped, they'll come after us." The trail down the backside of the mountain was steep and treacherous, but it was mercifully free of their pursuers. The team made good time, driven by the knowledge that discovery would likely mean death. They had descended about halfway down the mountain when they heard the sound that chilled them to the bone. Howls of rage and frustration coming from the area of the shelter. The creatures had discovered their escape. "Run," Tom said simply. The team abandoned all pretense of stealth and crashed down the mountain trail as fast as they dared. Behind them, the howls were getting closer, accompanied by the sound of large bodies crashing through the forest in pursuit. The race down the mountain was a desperate struggle against time, terrain, and exhaustion. The team had been running on adrenaline for over 24 hours, and their bodies were beginning to fail. Lisa stumbled and fell repeatedly, each time taking precious seconds to get back up. Marcus was helping Lisa when they heard the sound that meant their pursuers had reached the trail behind them. The creatures had figured out their escape route and were closing the distance with terrifying speed. "There!" Sarah pointed ahead to where a clearing was visible through the trees. "I can see vehicles." The ranger station's search and rescue team had established a staging area in the clearing, with multiple vehicles and personnel preparing for another rescue attempt. But they were still several hundred yards away, and the creatures behind them were getting closer by the second. Tom pulled out an emergency flare and fired it into the sky, hoping to alert the rescue team to their location. The bright red signal burst above the tree line, immediately drawing attention from the personnel in the clearing. The final sprint to safety was a race between the fleeing researchers and their superhuman pursuers. Jennifer fell and couldn't get up, her legs finally giving out from exhaustion. Marcus and David grabbed her arms and dragged her forward, but the delay cost them precious ground. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit were now terrifyingly close. They could hear heavy breathing and the snap of branches as their stalkers closed in for the final attack. The rescue team saw them coming and immediately began moving toward them. But they were clearly unprepared for what was about to emerge from the forest behind the fleeing researchers. "Get back!" Tom shouted to the rangers. "Get everyone back, they're right behind us." The research team burst from the forest and into the clearing just as their pursuers reached the tree line. For a moment, the two groups faced each other across 50 yards of open ground, 6 exhausted humans protected by a handful of rangers, and several massive creatures that seemed to be evaluating this new situation. The lead ranger, Captain Mike Harrison, had 30 years of experience with dangerous wildlife, but he'd never seen anything like the creatures at the forest edge. "What the hell are those things?" he whispered. "Unknown species," Sarah gasped, still struggling to catch her breath. "Highly intelligent, extremely dangerous." The standoff lasted for several long minutes. The creatures seemed to be studying the rescue team's equipment and assessing their capabilities. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they melted back into the forest. "They're not gone," Tom warned the rangers. "They're just repositioning. Those things are smarter than any animal I've ever encountered." Captain Harrison immediately began coordinating an evacuation. "We're getting everyone out of here right now. Full airlift, no delays." As the rescue helicopters arrived and began loading personnel, David made one final discovery that would haunt him for years to come. Through his camera's telephoto lens, he could see the creatures watching from the forest edge. But they weren't just watching, they were taking notes. One of the creatures was clearly observing the helicopters and their loading procedures, as if studying human technology and tactics for future reference. It was learning, preparing for the next encounter. The evacuation was completed without further incident, but as their helicopter lifted off and headed toward civilization, the research team knew they were leaving behind more than just their equipment and research data. They were leaving behind evidence of a new intelligence on Earth, one that was rapidly evolving and might soon pose a threat to human dominance of the natural world. 3 weeks later, Dr. Sarah Chen sat in a sterile conference room at the National Wildlife Research Center, facing a panel of government officials, military representatives, and fellow scientists. The debriefing had been going on for days, but the questions never seemed to end. "Dr. Chen," said Colonel Rebecca Martinez from the Pentagon's Special Projects Division, "based on your team's observations, What's your assessment of the threat level posed by these creatures? Sarah chose her words carefully. Based on their demonstrated intelligence, tool use, construction abilities, and coordinated tactical behavior, I believe we're looking at a species that could potentially challenge human dominance in wilderness areas. If their evolution continues at the accelerated rate we observed, they could become a significant threat to human activities in remote regions. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Dr. Jennifer Walsh had already briefed the panel on her theory about environmental stress triggering rapid evolution, and the evidence was mounting that these creatures represented something entirely new in Earth's biological history. What about containment options? Asked Dr. Elizabeth Freeman from the Centers for Disease Control. Conventional wildlife management approaches won't work, Tom Bradley replied. These creatures understand human technology and tactics. They learn from every encounter. Any containment strategy would have to account for opponents who get smarter every time you engage them. The panel continued their questioning for hours, but the fundamental questions remained unanswered. Where had these creatures come from? How many of them were there? And most importantly, what did their existence mean for the future of human exploration and settlement in wilderness areas? Marcus Rivera had spent the week since their escape analyzing every piece of data they'd collected, and his conclusions were sobering. The environmental conditions that triggered these mutations aren't unique to the Cascade Mountains, he reported. Similar stress factors exist in wilderness areas all over North America. If this is an evolutionary response to climate change and environmental degradation, we could be seeing the emergence of similar species in multiple locations. The meeting concluded with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear. The age of unchallenged human dominance over the natural world might be coming to an end. Somewhere in the wilderness, a new intelligence was evolving, learning, and preparing for a future where humans would no longer be the apex predators. Lisa Park returned to her graduate studies, but her research focus had changed completely. She was now part of a classified government program studying rapid evolution and environmental adaptation. The experience in the mountains had given her insights into evolutionary biology that no textbook could provide. David Kumar's photographs from the expedition had been classified at the highest levels, but he continued his work documenting environmental changes around the world. Everywhere he went, he looked for signs of the rapid evolutionary changes they'd witnessed in the Cascades. Dr. Jennifer Walsh established a new laboratory dedicated to studying environmentally triggered genetic mutations. Her work on the disease samples from the wolves had led to groundbreaking discoveries about how environmental stress could accelerate evolutionary processes. But it was Tom Bradley who perhaps understood the situation best. As someone who'd spent his entire life in the wilderness, he knew that the balance of power in remote areas had shifted permanently. The mountains he'd guided people through for decades were no longer safe for human visitors. The official report on the incident was classified and buried in government archives, but the researchers who'd lived through it knew the truth. Humanity was no longer alone at the top of the evolutionary ladder. Somewhere in the wilderness, a new intelligence was growing stronger and smarter with each passing day. And it was watching, learning, waiting for the next encounter. 6 months after the incident, reports began filtering in from wilderness areas across North America. Hikers disappearing without a trace. Campsites found destroyed with signs of unusual animal activity. Rangers reporting sightings of creatures that didn't match any known species. Each incident was investigated quietly, the evidence gathered and analyzed by the same classified team that had debriefed Sarah's research group. The pattern was becoming clear. The phenomenon they'd encountered in the Cascades was spreading. Dr. Sarah Chen now headed a secret government task force dedicated to monitoring and understanding what they'd come to call rapid evolutionary events. Her team included the survivors from the original expedition, along with specialists in genetics, environmental science, and military strategy. Their mission was simple in concept, but terrifying in scope: to study and prepare for a world where humans were no longer the dominant intelligence on Earth. Because every piece of evidence they gathered pointed to the same conclusion: the creatures in the mountains were just the beginning. The evolutionary pressure that had created them was active in wilderness areas around the globe, and it was accelerating. Nature was adapting to human dominance by creating new forms of intelligence specifically designed to compete with and potentially replace human control over the natural world. The age of exploration was over. The age of coexistence, or conflict, with a new intelligence had begun. As Sarah sat in her office late one evening, reviewing the latest reports from field teams around the world, she couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in the wilderness, those same intelligent eyes were watching human activities with the same intensity that her team was watching them. The hunt, she realized, was far from over. It was just beginning, and this time humans might not be the predators. The last ridge had been crossed, and on the other side, a new world was waiting. One where humanity would have to learn to share the Earth with intelligence that was growing stronger, smarter, and more dangerous with each passing day. In the mountains where it all began, the creatures continued their construction projects, building something that human observers could only guess at. But whatever they were creating, it was clear that it was designed for a future where the balance of power between species would be very different from the world humans had always known. The wilderness was no longer wild. It was becoming something else entirely. Something that watched, learned, and planned with an intelligence that was rapidly approaching and possibly exceeding human capabilities. And in research facilities and government offices around the world, scientists and officials prepared for a future none of them had ever imagined, a future where humanity's greatest challenge might not come from space or from each other, but from the Earth itself, as nature evolved new forms of intelligence specifically designed to compete with human dominance. The story of the last ridge was over, but the larger story of coexistence with a new intelligence was just beginning. And no one knew how that story would end.